Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Well, if you watch me regularly, you know that starting on January 1st, we went to a different type of programming on Chef AJ Live where guests have regular slots on the show. And this being the second Sunday of the month, we are honored to have back Dr. Peter Rogers. He's going to be talking today about breast and prostate cancer and how you can lower your estrogen levels. Please welcome Dr. Rogers back. It's nice to see you again with such an important topic.
Hi, thanks. Should I start slides?
Absolutely. Did you draw that yourself, Dr.
Oh,
Rogers?
no, my kid drew that. The kid's an artist.
Pretty good.
Yeah, so basically, I was thinking I'm going to be talking about breast cancer, prostate cancer, and estrogenic chemicals and how one can lower their estrogen levels. But I also know from experience, people always start asking me questions about soy. So I'll briefly just say a few things about soy. And one point I'd like to make, soy has got estrogens like off the charts, and flax is even more estrogen. So I asked myself, let's take a look at a woman over here. And by the way, I was first sort of thinking, all these female names, they all end in A. The male name ends with a consonant, the female ends with A, but the big exception to that would be the word banana. And anyways, it was obvious to me why a woman has estrogen, okay? She has breasts, she's got a Virginia. I mean, it's obvious, okay? But I don't understand why soy needs to have estrogen off the charts. Why does it have thousands and thousands and thousands of times more estrogen than other foods? Same thing with flax, off the charts. And when you think about it, it actually does make sense because the estrogen is a way to prevent it from being eaten. Everything is working, bud.
I know, I gotta get
Is that
the
electricity? Okay. So what I'm saying is, if some plants want to be eaten, the bear in the woods eats the berries and then it walks a couple miles away and it defecates, and that helps the berries to grow somewhere else. But there's other plants that don't want to be eaten. And by having very high estrogens, as we know in humans, the typical birth control pill is a thionyl estradiol, EE2. This is a way that they can make the animal that eats them infertile, as well as estrogens in these excessive amounts can sometimes, as is the case with soy and animal studies, certainly be associated with hypothyroidism. So you can make the animal tired. Something fell off. I think it was my earring or something. This thing fell off, Pav.
That's fine. That's fine. That's fine.
We'll pick it up before I break it. And the chair's going to roll over. Anyways, so my sound's okay. So
You sound great.
What's basically happening is it's a way to get animals to stop eating it. Okay. All right. Well, we'll talk a little more about soy later, but I just wanted to introduce that concept because you should always ask yourself the question: when something is off the charts different, none of the other beans is like that. There's no other plants that are like that except soy and flax, off the chart estrogenic chemicals. Okay. Now here I gotta advance the slide.
Wait,
bud.
but are you saying not to eat soy and flax?
Well, that's a big debatable subject, and I know that 99% of the people on the internet think it's great. I'm just going to share with you the papers I went through. So we're going to come to that a little later because I just know from experience, people just keep asking. I could care less about soy, but my point of view is I'm a man, okay? I want to have high testosterone. I want to be strong, okay? Also, estrogenic chemicals are associated with increased risk of prostate cancer in general. So I want to avoid them for that reason. The prostate's sort of the male equivalent to the female uterus. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about breast cancer, just briefly about prostate cancer, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about this estrogenic chemistry because most people are not familiar with it. I'll actually show everybody a book. Here's a book called Estrogeneration. I read a whole bunch of books on estrogen and especially estrogen chemistry, a couple of books, and this is the best one. So it's written by this guy, Anthony J. He's a PhD biochemist. He specializes in lipids. It's a great book. It's one of the all-time great health books. If you're interested in estrogen chemistry, that's the best one to start with. Okay, and so what I'm saying is a lot of things we just don't even think about. I'm a typical fat guy. You say, oh, he's got a beer belly. Oh, that's apple shape. Well, maybe it's also, he looks like a pregnant female, and maybe those little fatty boobs, those moobs, man boobs, gynecomastia, the medical word, maybe that's because of estrogen too. Okay, I think that people are much more estrogen overloaded than they realize. And westernized environments from these chemicals are relatively ubiquitous. Here's another picture. I sort of briefly alluded to this, the one of comparing the Pima, which is a population in Arizona now, with the Tarahumara in northern Mexico. These populations were together in what is now northern Mexico. Back in the Mexican-American War in 1848, they got separated. The Pima have taken on a westernized lifestyle and diet, and they have tons of obesity and sickness. And these Western diseases tend to progress from ischemia, lack of blood flow, atherosclerosis, which becomes worse by diabetes and hypertension. So they end up plugging up arteries everywhere in their body. So I call that TBI, total body ischemia. And Nathan Pritikin was very much into this idea as well. And I think he's right. In my experience in medicine over 30 years thinking about this, I think it is absolutely correct. Whereas somebody like Tadahumada, these are the guys who could run 100 miles in 2 days with incredible energy. That's what a low-fat, low-sodium, plant-based diet does for people. They've been visited by people. Ruth Heidrich visited them. Other long-distance marathon runners have visited them. There's a guy, McDougall. It's not our Dr. McDougall. It's a different McDougall. Went and wrote a book about them. They're incredible running ability. So they're pretty well known. There was an evolutionary biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich. He was actually one of my professors at Stanford, and he made a very clever metaphor about evolutionary biology and environment. He says, if you had an airplane and you just randomly popped off a couple of rivets every day, he said, you could remove a lot of rivets before you'd have problems, but it's not a smart thing to do, and it will create unpredictable problems, and eventually the plane won't fly. And that's basically what a person is doing when they're eating a poor diet, not exercising, and not living in a healthy way. Plus, people are unknowingly exposing themselves to a lot of toxins. And here's a very good quote by current molecular biologist Michael Skinner. He says, aging is being poisoned. And most of it, kind of like the concept of the movie Forks and Knives. People do it without even realizing they're doing it. And so I like the Socrates quote, in order for us to live well, we should learn what is good for us and what is bad for us. And that totally fits. Learn what foods are good for you, what amount of sleep and exercise and social relations, they build up your life, and know how to avoid the toxins that are bad for us. You have to know what the toxins are so that you could be able to avoid them. And here's a nice quote by Ayn Rand. She says, in order for a man to live, he must act. In order to act, he must make choices. In order to make choices, he must define a code of values. And in order to define a code of values, he must know what he is and where he is. He must know his own nature and the nature of the universe. He needs philosophy. He cannot escape this need. The only alternative is whether the philosophy guiding him is to be chosen by his mind or by chance. And so what I mean by that is you can't escape knowing about nutrition and health. I mean, if you want to, you have to know how to eat right for yourself and to maintain your stress levels and avoid toxins. Otherwise, you're going to get sick, and there's no doctor can save you from that. The individual has to do it. And then the big frustration for anybody in the health nutrition field is, how do you communicate with patients? And one thing that comes up is Lita Hollingsworth. She was a psychologist who worked with high IQ students, and she ran a school for children with IQs 130 and over. And she said that there was something called the Hollingsworth communication range, whereby people communicate best, according to her, in a given context if they're within about 30 so-called IQ points in that given topic, that field. And she said if somebody's more than 30 points different or lower, they often seem dull to the other person. If somebody's higher 30 points, they seem weird, nerdy, or autistic. And because a lot of patients, you try talking about nutrition and health, they think it's a big joke. They're like, what are you talking about, this nutrition nonsense? Just, give me the pill. I thought I came here for a surgery. And what I'm saying is, also in my family, whenever people tell me I'm being weird or autistic, I just say, hey, you know what? I think we have a Hollingsworth problem here. Okay, so now here's the concept of 5 blind men and an elephant. Basically, this is sort of an Indian story, and it's very useful. The idea that, the first blind guy comes here, he feels a tail, he says it feels like a rope. The second one, oh, it feels like a wall. The tusk is like a spear, the ear like a rug. And the point being is, you put it all together, all the different components of studying a topic, and then one can see like a bird's eye view from above, the big picture. And one of the great things about nutrition is that one can see that everything fits. If you look at the historical epidemiology in history, what are the diseases people had as a given country changed its diet and lifestyle? Look at the geographical epidemiology. What's the difference between, United States versus Japan, China, Kenya, etc., Peru, the Pima, Tarahumara, Yanomamo, etc. The comparative anatomy of us with other herbivores versus carnivores. We are like herbivores. The personal experience one gets from trying the diet and this lifestyle. Looking at the mechanisms in biochemistry. Are there plausible biochemistry mechanisms? What is the research on humans? What is the research on animals? So the point I'm saying, the wonderful thing about all this is it all works. It all fits together. And that's also one of the reasons why I really liked reading a lot of the Dr. McDougall stuff, because it had a cohesive frame of reference to put it all together So you not only know what to do, you understand why you do what you do, and that enables you to make adjustments when new questions or problems arise. Okay, so a little bit more of this philosophy stuff just to get the right mindset, because I think it helps. A man who cannot persuade other men, he can't save them either. So one has to have that ability. And if somebody's a good persuader, even if they don't know as much, they can really help people. And actually, that ends up coming up a lot. And I think doctors really mean well, and they want to help their patients, but they're so exhausted from all of their training through, college, med school, residency, and fellowship. They learn all the blood tests, but they don't learn about nutrition and toxicology. Then they're exhausted trying to make partner to job, et cetera, that they just have to memorize standard of care. They don't think about this nutrition stuff, but they need to know it if they're going to save people for these chronic diseases, because conventional medicine essentially defines all these chronic diseases as chronic because it never can cure them, ever. Think about that. Diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, sleep apnea, arthritis, and a lot of other stuff. It's never cured. And that's what's great about the vegan diet. It routinely cures those things all the time, especially if they're caught early. Sometimes it becomes too late. There's tissue damage that's irreversible. Okay, I've gone through all the medical textbooks, and I can tell you on most of these common diseases, the textbooks are 50 to 100 years out of date, or they're completely wrong. If you think about a coronary artery disease, there'll be no mention of Kempner, Doctors Kempner, Ornish, Roberts. These are the famous pioneers of the field, and they're not even in the book. Hypertension, again, no Kempner, Pritikin, Richard Moore. Autoimmune, there's no mention of Dr. Swank, McDougall, Abdomen, Burkitt. Diabetes, Sweeney, Hemsworth, Brownlee, Shulman. So all of the most famous people in these different fields, they're not even in any of the books. I'm telling you, it's unbelievable, but that is true. You can check for yourself. And then here's a quote this reminds me of. I'm going to get into a lot of chemistry, biochemistry, all kinds of fancy stuff, but I wanted to start out with this philosophy to set the mindset, to realize, we're fortunate to have this information. And once we learn it, we're a lot better off. But I think this mindset helps. Here's a quote I like from Soren Kierkegaard. It happened that a fire broke out backstage in a theater. The patient got sick. The clown came out to inform the public about nutrition and toxicology. They thought it was a jest and applauded. The clown repeated his warning, and they all laughed even louder. So I think the world will come to an end. Patients get sicker amid general applause from all the wits who think it is a joke. And in my experience, that's kind of true. Everybody thinks this nutrition and food stuff is a joke. And they also apply what I would call social thinking. By social thinking, I mean, if you went in high school, there were some kids you might have thought were a jerk in high school, but you meet them at the high school reunion 10 years later, they got pretty good manners. Okay, people learn eventually social skills because they have to get along with others and survive. But like a herbivore, where it's safe to be in the middle of the pack, people tend to apply social thinking to nutrition, and that doesn't work. In my opinion, I think for nutritional thinking, you should be, look what Esselstyn says, moderation kills. It doesn't work. You have to think, and I'm kind of joking here, but almost like in a religious sense. And I made 10 commandments of nutrition. Okay. And you also, it's good to say it's your own fault. People say, oh, well, you don't want to offend the patient. You don't want to hurt their feelings. Tell them it's their own fault. In my opinion, it's always good that something's your fault in the sense that it gives you a chance to fix it. You can control yourself. So if you're fat because it's genetic, what are you going to do about that? But if you're fat because you eat the wrong food, you can change what you eat. If you're fat because you expose yourself to toxins all the time out of ignorance, you could change that. You can learn your way out of that problem. So here's the 10 commandments of nutrition. Starch is the true god of food. Thou shalt put no other foods before starch. Starches include potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice, beans, oatmeal, quinoa. Eat starch to satisfy your hunger and provide energy. Starch is the way. Starch is the entree. Should be 50 to 90% of your calories. Thine hypothalamus is a thermostat. Hypothalamic hunger center forces you to eat exactly the amount of food that you do. The hunger center is set by the almighty hunger drive, and it will crush any willpower attempts to change. You can't change it by just trying to eat less over time. That doesn't work. Eat less, exercise more doesn't work. You have to change what you eat. Okay, vegetables, commandment number 3, vegetables and fruits are the best source of nutrients. For every meal, ask yourself, what starch, what fruit, what vegetable? Commandment 4, plants provide what you need to spread your seed. They make you more attractive. Vegans are more attractive. They're thinner. They have a glow of vitality because their skin and their body's better perfused. They get more vasodilatation because they got a lot more potassium, more nitric oxide and magnesium. It gives them a youthful glow of vitality. And this is not a diet. That's a ridiculous thing that you're just going to eat something different for 3 weeks and all of a sudden reset everything. No, you just have to eat healthy every day. Okay, number 6, thou shalt not eat meat. Meat's much worse than people realize. It makes you fat over time because it's a very high fat food, which predisposes to diabetes, hypertension. Milk is like a liquid meat. Cheese is a meat jello. When you eat it, you end up looking like the animal it came from. A pizza on your plate, like a cheese pizza, is very much like an atherosclerotic plaque looks inside your arteries. Besides that, meat increases leaky gut, postprandial lipotoxemia, xenocellulitis, TMAO, all these things. There's no fiber in meat, so you get constipated. You end up with Burkitt's abdominal pressure syndrome. Meat also causes iron overload because it's like, especially the heme iron, it's very high in that. And as a person gets older, men become iron overloaded starting in their 20s, women when they're postmenopausal, and that predisposes to oxidative stress, increasing cancer risk, etc. Meat has higher levels of leucine, methionine, lysine, and that's associated with increased activation of mTOR, mechanistic target of rapamycin, which is a growth pathway, nutrient sensing pathway that causes a cell to grow. Also increased insulin-like growth factor, which is also anabolic. It makes cells grow and divide, which accelerates aging and also can accelerate the growth of cancer. I did a lecture one time on how does meat cause cancer, and it increased the risk of cancer in over 30 ways. That's a big reason why I say no meat. Okay, number 7, thou shalt not eat oils. Oils are liquid fat and make you fat. All processed oils are bad, including olive oil and omega-3, in my opinion. I know that's a big statement, but I believe it is true. We'll talk about that later. Oils cause blood sludge, which is atherogenic. Oils cause decreased arterial vasodilatation and endothelial dysfunction. Oils cause lipid peroxidation, which damages the hypothalamus and hippocampal neurons and pancreatic beta cells. That's especially due to the work of Dr. Tetsumori Yamashima, the Japanese neuroscientist. Oils are tumor promoters. If thou must go to a restaurant, then choose the buffet and eat your salad without dressing. Skip the dressing and thou shalt look better undressed. Okay, you don't need salad dressing. People ask me that. All right, number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against the vegan diet. There are 2 kingdoms of food. The vegan is the land of healthy aging, like the Tarahumara, Okinawa, Yamamamo, rural Kenyans, Papua New Guinea, Loma Linda, etc. The meat junk food is the land of the fat and the sick, like the Pima and other eaters of the SAD diet, standard American diet. And you may ask yourself, what about fat vegans? They have fallen into temptation of oils and sweets, the siren song of philosophic vegetarians. Do not be fooled by these false prophets. The path to optimal body weight is orthodox veganism. Low sodium, low fat, whole food, 100% organic, 100% plant-based, no oil, no caffeine, no alcohol, no sweets. Now, I realize that's a little bit kind of restrictive and severe. I'm thinking about, preventing yourself from being sick. If you're 20 years old, you can get away with a lot more than you can after 50. All right. When the rest of your age's cohort is fat, diabetic, and woodless, hooked on hypertension pills, and worried about open heart surgery, you'll be waking up with the Johnson working fine. Okay. Number 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's plate of GMO-fed, herbicide-sprayed, hormonally hypertrophied, antibiotic-assaulted, hexane extracted food. The more you study processed food, the worse it is. Okay. Oh, and then here's does that sound like too much? Get thee an attitude of gratitude. Heal your objections, and the diet may heal you. Hath not the Lord provided safe passage through the Red Sea?
Frozen.
Oh, we're frozen? Hello? Oh, can you hear me? Pavel! Pavel! Oh, can you hear me? Let me get my kit.
There we go. We're back, Dr. Rogers.
Pavel, we're back?
We just froze for a moment.
We're back? Okay, hold on a second.
Back.
I ran to go get the kid.
We're good.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see. We froze just for a few moments.
Oh, okay. All right.
It happens sometimes with Zoom.
All right. Okay, so then here I just wanted to give people a sense of a day in the life of the average American. And I'm going to get into a lot of technical stuff, so I wanted to kind of build the base first and help people to realize Americans are exposed to tons of estrogenic chemicals, more than you could imagine. If you haven't studied it, you would be amazed. There's textbooks on all the estrogenic chemicals people are exposed to. So first of all, here's an average day. A person wakes up, they take a shower. Most people shower in tap water. They are inhaling the chlorine. That's not so much of an issue by itself. It's a minor thing, but there's lots of estrogens in municipal water because it's too expensive to remove them. And then in chemistry, like dissolves like. So when it gets on your skin, that's absorbed transdermally. So they're being exposed to estrogens in the water. Plus, they put aluminum typically in municipal water because paradoxically, it clarifies the water. But that's called a metalloestrogen. And so people are being exposed to a lot of estrogen just by taking a shower. Then the typical thing they do is they put a deodorant on themselves. The deodorant has aluminum in it that plugs up the pores, and it also has preservatives like parabenzoic acid. Parabens, they typically call them. You share the lymphatics between the breast and the axilla. And what happens is upper outer quadrant, It used to be there's only about 30% of breast cancers are there. Now it's about 60%. And that's thought to largely be due to putting deodorant on. Plus, people shave their armpits. And when they shave their armpit, they're increasing transdermal absorption. I don't wear deodorant because, you walk in the room, what do? You say, hey, how you doing? Okay. We're not like a dog. We don't walk up and smell each other's armpits. You don't need deodorant. I think it's just conformist habits of advertising. People are conditioned to do that. Okay. And all my life talking with guys about women plenty of times, never once did a guy ever say, well, I'm not attracted to her because of her armpit odor. It's like a non-issue in the man's mind, in my experience. Okay. What are some other things? Now on the clothing, typically people will do their laundry with estrogenic detergent, let's say a liquid detergent. It's going to have harsh estrogenic preservatives. The bottle's made out of BPA, bisphenol A, with phthalates. That's both plastics. They leach into the liquid detergent. The dryer squares are estrogenic, and people a lot of times wear polyester clothes, polyethylene terephthalate, and that's estrogenic too. So all day long, their skin is in contact with estrogenic chemicals that are absorbed into across their skin, into their body. And you think about it, if you go for a swim in the water, you don't instantly gain 20 pounds. And the reason is because your skin is designed to keep out water, but it is not designed to keep out lipid. So that's why you don't want to be rubbing all these things on you. They're transdermally absorbed. Like some people will put all these moisturizers and stuff, okay, or sunscreens. They're full of estrogenic chemicals that are transdermally absorbed. For breakfast, typical person in, let's say America, the United States, they're eating a high-fat diet, so they get ischemia of the tissues, and it's also high sodium, vasoconstriction, poorly perfused tissues, increase in tissue hypoxia, lack of oxygen, which increases cancer risk over time and decreases healing. And it changes the gut flora. There's basically two types of gut flora. You either have good gut flora from the fiber and plant food, or you have bad gut flora from meat and processed food, which has a lack of fiber. And what happens is with bad gut flora, the bacteria have increased enzyme called glucuronidase, and that will deconjugate estrogen that's been excreted by your liver. You're supposed to defecate it out of your body to lower estrogen levels. So when you're eating a meat and processed food diet, estrogen levels go up. And I can tell you, I've seen women who've told me, Dr. Rogers, they said, every woman in my family had to get a hysterectomy before 35 years of age. And you know what? If you look, Mayo Clinic did a study on about 2,000 patients. Women who get a hysterectomy before 35 years of age have an increased risk of congestive heart failure, myocardial infarction, and dementia at an early age. Whenever I see a demented female who's like unexpectedly demented, she's not a drug addict or something like that, or an alcoholic, it's very often because she had a hysterectomy at a young age. And I think the reason is men see their friends starting to get sick around 40 years of age and older, so they get a little scared. Oh, I better watch my cholesterol and all this stuff. Whereas I think women are oblivious to it a lot of times because it's a non-issue typically for postmenopausal women. And so once they lose the uterus, so to speak, they're no longer menstruate. So the hematocrit goes up higher. Their blood is thicker. Plus, when red blood cells are released from the spleen, for example, and from the bone marrow, from the bone marrow, they are more flexible initially. They're more deformable. They can more readily pass through a capillary. Typical RBC is about 7 microns. Capillary is about 5 microns. So what happens is, as they get older, towards their end lifespan of about 120 days, they get glycated. They become stiff, harder to pass through that capillary. So what am I saying? A woman who's menstruating has more youthful red blood cells, more flexible, and that lowers her blood pressure. That gives women a lower blood pressure, which protects them again from atherosclerosis. So when she gets a hysterectomy, she's now getting a higher hematocrit plus more glycated, stiff red blood cells, raising her blood pressure, predisposing her to all the atherosclerosis complications. Okay, getting back to the typical American's day, they're often having some form of caffeine, like coffee for breakfast. That elevates their blood lipids, elevates their blood pressure. It mimics stress. It's the same hormones, cortisol and catecholamines, the adrenaline, noradrenaline, and that is a mild immunosuppressant as well. And we talked about this, and there's been lectures, you've had the guests before on there talking about the effect of mouthwash or toothpaste. It wipes out the tongue bacteria, so you no longer convert the plant nitrates, NO3s, to nitrites, NO2s. And you need gastric acid then to make them go to nitric oxide, NO1 oxygen per nitrogen. And that increases their atherosclerotic risk because it decreases their blood nitric oxide. Female birth control pills, EE2 is a typical thing. It's estrogenic. Okay. Then they commute in their car. Typically there's like sunscreen chemicals in there on the seats to prevent sun damage. Those can also be transdermally absorbed. That's that new car smell. And I've joked before that my cousin used to smell the car seat. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he goes, it smells like a woman. And I'm like, that's an ignorant thing to do, smelling plastic. Okay. Habits. A lot of people put their cell phone in their front pocket. Okay, I think that increases, it's a low power microwave transmitter. You don't want that next to your cojones all day long. All right. A lot of women put their cell phone in the front pocket. I think that's an ignorant thing to do. I would be concerned about having that right next to the breast all day, or their back pocket. You might have that near your rectum, might increase the risk of rectal cancer. Now, how significant is that? I don't know. You could probably do it many, many years, but I wouldn't do it. I just wouldn't do it. I would put it like in, your purse or your backpack or something. Okay, eating snacks now as the day goes on. Oh, another thing, lots of guys, they put a laptop computer right on their lap, right next to their cojones, if you will. And it's probably not a great idea. Low power microwave transmitter with the Wi-Fi and whatnot. Okay, taking a snack. The bottled water is typically in an estrogenic container, like PET, polyethylene terephthalate. The phthalate is an estrogen. It'll contain other things in there you might not want. If you eat an energy bar, it'll often contain MSG. It's a neurotoxin potentially. Most of these processed foods, they often have colors in them, artificial dyes, which are like petroleum-based chemicals, often estrogenic, like red number 3, red number 40. High fructose corn syrup is often from GMO corn. It's been sprayed with toxic herbicides, typically Estrogen, which is strongly estrogenic. That's the famous estrogenic herbicide that's associated with turning male frogs into female frogs. I'll show you that paper. You've also got GMO soy, which is very estrogenic. Soy is typically used to provide soy protein isolate for all kinds of processed foods. Basically, corn provides cheap sugar and soy provides cheap protein to make processed food. That's also sprayed with the herbicide glyphosate, GP typically they call it. That's highly estrogenic. It's potentially neurotoxic. This lady is often given lectures on that subject. Then they, for lunch, they'll have a diet soda pop, often with aspartame. That's a neurotoxin. My slides are a little different on this computer than the other one, but I think you get the drift. I haven't even got to dinner yet, and the person's already been exposed to numerous estrogens. And here's where it almost gets a little scary. If you look at a woman's blood, you draw her blood for estrogen. Her menstrual cycle is going to vary her estrogen from about 20 picograms per milliliter on up to 400. A man usually stays fixed at about 20 picograms per milliliter. So he's got the same estrogen level as a woman when she's in the low estrogen part of her cycle. And here's my point. You can have thousands of picograms of some of these contaminants. So even if they're only a weak stimulator of an estrogen receptor, they can sort of overwhelm that receptor just by their large amounts. So they can be a big deal, because you'll sometimes hear, oh, these other types of estrogens are not that big of a deal. All right, now here's a story from when I was in college. I went to Stanford University in California there, and I'm kind of joking here about what's another reason why men in the United States have lower testosterone levels than ever and lower sperm count levels than ever. And here's the story. Basically, the kind of joke at Stanford was 9 out of 10 California girls are pretty, and the 10th one goes to Stanford. And lots of guys, were good athletes. I lived in the athlete fraternity. Same one as, the pro football quarterback, John Elway and Jim Plunkett, Super Bowl pro quarterbacks. And basically, these guys were used to having girlfriends in high school, but many of them did not have girlfriends in college. I was with my old high school girlfriend for a while. I never had a girlfriend from Stanford once, ever. Okay. And I was captain of the wrestling team, all this other stuff. All right. It was hard to get a girlfriend at Stanford, and it is what it is. So anyways, this one guy in our fraternity was known as the matchmaker, which was a joke because he had a stack of magazines over here, and the PB doesn't stand for plant-based. So the joke was, I was having pizza in his room one time. He had us over, and I saw this napkin on the ground. I had some grease on my face, so I went to wipe it, and he goes, dude, what are you doing with my spank rag? So I'm kind of joking here, but what I'm trying to say is, I don't think, everybody knows if they've had sons that when they hit the teenage years, they start spending a lot more time in the shower, and they shouldn't be rubbing. Shampoo is full of estrogenics. A lot of soaps are, and all these moisturizers are. So one of them said to me, perhaps you could come up with a non-estrogenic plant-based lubricant. Okay. So anyways, all I'm saying is this is another way that there's a lot of estrogens being put on an area where you don't want a high estrogen concentrated dosage being applied. Okay, a little disclaimer here, because I'm going to be talking about cancer. You always need a disclaimer when you talk about cancer. And this talk is kind of a continuation of a previous talk I did about a month ago, where I talked about what would I do if I had cancer. So I'm going to get into that in a little more detail here. So I'm not a cancer doctor. I'm not a cancer researcher. I do not manage the care of cancer patients. I'm simply telling you what I have learned from studying cancer. I have studied cancer quite a bit. I've done over 1,000 biopsies. I've read on the subject very extensively. I went through all the details of it with my mother. And basically what I'm saying is, I think humans have a species-specific diet And the same diet and lifestyle that protects them from chronic diseases dramatically lowers the risk of cancer. So I think there's great benefits in that. Okay. We talked briefly last time about the 3 categories of cancer. And this comes from George Cryle at the Cleveland Clinic and Gilbert Welch, that a vulture is a cancer that comes on so quickly. Imagine you were a farmer with a big farmed in land, maybe like, let's say 50 square miles, and there's a fence around it here, and you want to keep the animals in the center in an animal enclosure. If the vulture escapes, he will fly out of the enclosure and kill the patient before anything can be done. It'll happen between screening intervals. You can't screen for a vulture, but a vulture type of rapidly aggressive cancer is so rare that you might as well forget about it. They'll make a movie about you if it happens. It's rare stuff. Then a rabbit is what most people think about as a cancer. And they think, oh, the rabbit's broken out of his central enclosure. He's making a run for the fence. We don't want that. Try to catch the rabbit, stop him. And that's what conventional cancer therapy is all about, is dealing with rabbits. But here's the reality. Most cancers are not rabbits or vultures. The vast majority of cancers are turtles, meaning that they grow so slow, you don't even want to know about them. The patient's going to die for some other reason. And that's one of the dangers of screening, is you're going to find a lot of turtles, for example, in the prostate. And they have a tendency, because everybody gets worried, oh, it's cancer, we got to do surgery, we got to do all these other things. And it might just be a turtle that you don't want to really do anything, because it's not going to hurt you. And what I'm saying is, you can go get screened for prostate cancer, check your PSA, prostate specific antigen. It's a blood test that indicates increased risk of prostate cancer, and end up with your prostate taken out surgically, leading to urinary incontinence and a lot of pain and impotence. That doesn't always happen, but it happens a significant amount of time when you might have just had a turtle. Okay. So it's really worth knowing about these things to protect your health. And another thing I'm going to talk about is, we usually think of a cancer as being a rabbit, but there's more to rabbits. We're going to talk about, the real question is, does that rabbit already have a tendril under the fence that it made at night and have babies on the other side, micrometastases? And it's going to turn out that it often does. Now, this was a lecture Dr. McDougall gave on breast cancer, and he's got a really good lecture on breast cancer. And I think mine is complementary. I'm going to be more about the molecular biology and biochemistry. He's more about the practical stuff that the cancer patient experiences. And an important concept to understand is that of doubling time. Typical doubling time is about 100 days. So one cell doubles becomes 2, doubles becomes 4 in another 100 days. But the point was, you usually can't see it on a mammogram until it's in the ballpark of getting close to a centimeter. And by that time, usually the patient will have metastatic disease in other locations that you can't see on imaging yet, micrometastatic disease. And Dr. McDougall says they virtually always have micrometastatic disease before you can detect it. And this is highly relevant, because the breast cancer, that doesn't kill the patient. It's the metastases, we call them mets, that kills the patient. So the game, the battle is not in the boob, it's in the body. Okay. And what that means is, there's going to be micrometastases in widespread locations. So a localized surgery is not going to remove all the cancer. It just doesn't do it, because it's in other locations. So one really needs an immune system to function, because it's the immune system that removes the micrometastases from your body. You can't get around that. Okay, and here's an article showing quantitative cell shedding of mammary tumor. And even a tumor as small as 1 gram, a tiny little tumor, was shedding millions of cells into the blood every day. And the point from this, again, is you need to have a good immune system. I can tell you, I've been studying cancer for years. This is one of the most important things you could know. If your immune system is functioning well, that protects you from all kinds of things. It helps protect you from a lot of infections and cancers. It does what you want it to do. So always remember that, because we'll talk about how does one optimize immune function. And you need to know it's absolutely super important. Okay, now here's the big picture on cancer. That it starts out, and they have 3 phases. Initiation is typically an injury to the cell for whatever the reason. And there's 2 main theories of what injures a cell. The old theory was what was called the mutational theory, or the SMT is somatic mutation theory. And that is that the DNA was injured by a mutation. Something causes a mutation is a mutagen or mutagenic, by some chemical or a virus. And that's usually what people think, and that's what doctors are trained in. But there's another big theory of cancer, and I think it's a much better theory. It's called the metabolic theory of cancer, MTC. And this was largely put forth by Otto Warburg. He won the Nobel Prize in 1931, that when something causes hypoxia, less oxygen delivery to a tissue, that will cause many cells to die, but some will transform into cancer, okay? So that's a really important part, and you want to know this. The metabolic theory of cancer gives you all kinds of ways you can help yourself. the mutational somatic mutation theory, it doesn't really explain things that well. And in my opinion, I think it's largely been refuted. The Genome Atlas Project, which is about 10 years ago, they could not find a good, consistent pattern of mutations. A lot of people even gave up researching cancer because they were so frustrated by the lack of coherence in the mutational theory. Okay. And now here's probably one of the most important things you can know in this whole talk. Tumor promotion is the next phase. And this is where you really can do a lot to stop cancer from growing. You can't change initiation. There could have been something, at least you can't change what happened in the past. You could have been exposed to a carcinogenic chemical or had hypoxia of an organ system many years ago, and you can't turn back the clock. But here's where you can do a ton of stuff. You can slow down tumor promotion. And this really highlights the work of T. Colin Campbell. He wrote a great book, one of the best nutrition books ever written, called The China Study. And he talked about how working with rodents, if he would drop the amount of animal protein given to the rodent from 20% down to 5% or less, they would not progress their cancers, almost never. So by dropping the percent of animal protein, he in the rodent studies was dramatically able to reduce cancer growth. And so what I'm saying is, well, gee, there's a lot more that you could do than just drop animal protein. He even recommended animal protein should be dropped to 0. And I would agree with that. There's multiple reasons for that. In addition, estrogenic chemicals will cause induced proliferation of cells like breast ductal cells, uterus cells, endometrial cells, and prostate cells. So by reducing estrogenics, you've got a chance to slow down those types of tumors. We talked about people becoming iron overloaded. That contributes to tumor promotion. We talked about elevated insulin, which occurs primarily from a high-fat diet, and insulin-like growth factor, which especially occurs from a high-protein diet, especially animal protein. You can reduce those things and minimize these hormonal growth stimulants. That's what you want to do. All of these things will then activate mTOR. mTOR is like a nutrient sensing pathway. It's like a contractor deciding if it's ready to build the building. It can't build the building until it has all the building materials. So it has to get leucine. It has to get these other components, but leucine is a rate limiting step, and leucine is much more present in meat. So that's why eating meat will tend to activate mTOR and tell the cell to divide. So it accelerates cancer growth. Plus, we also have something called the Hayflick limit. Hayflick was a molecular biologist in the 1900s who was working with human tissue culture, and he found that cells would typically only divide about 60 times, unless they were stem cells or germ cells. And what he found was at 60 cell divisions, they would then start to die. So the point is, if you're accelerating cell replication, you are accelerating your arrival at the Hayflick limit, and thus you are accelerating your aging. You don't want that. If you're 20 years old and you're a bodybuilder, they're going to say, check out our new protein supplement. We got more branched chain amino acids, lots of leucine. Maybe you want accelerated cell growth and division when you're 20-year-old bodybuilder, but man, you're over 40. You don't want your prostate getting bigger and potentially being cancer, or your breasts or anything else. Okay. And then we talk about ongoing hypoxia makes all these things worse as well. And immunosuppression, all these things make cancer more likely to spread, metastasize, and kill the patient. All right, so I like a seesaw here to explain the difference between where a person could be. So basically, it's good to spend a lot of time in sort of a maintenance phase. Like after you exercise, the body's low on energy and it has to sort of replenish itself. It has to rebuild the amount of ATP in all your different cells. That's good. It activates what's called an AMP. AMPK is how it's usually abbreviated, but it's the AMP, meaning adenosine monophosphate. That's a low energy phase in a cell in comparison with ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay. And you want that because when a cell is low energy, it says, hey, no growth, shut off replication. We need to just replenish our ATP, get everything back together after this exercise episode. We got to make ourselves a little stronger for next time. We're going to build some new mitochondria, make sure all our mitochondria are functioning well. Exercise is tremendously helpful to you. A lot of survivors of metastatic cancer, exercise played a major role in their recovery. It also gets your lymphatic flowing better, and it shuts off mTOR. All right. A carbohydrate diet also helps decrease the activity of mTOR. Getting your sleep, the good hormones, melatonin, love, oxytocin, and all that stuff, that's all good for you. Having a sense of purpose, these make you more resilient. So what you don't want is to be totally stressed out and sleep deprived. That elevates your stress hormones. Caffeine makes that worse as well. Increased cortisol suppresses your immune system. It becomes less able to remove cancer cells from your body. The metastases are more likely to progress. mTOR is activated in the growth phase. So if you're eating lots of animal protein, you got all that leucine on board, the mTOR is more likely to signal the cell, now's the time to replicate, means speeding up cancer growth. Elevated dietary fat causes insulin resistance. I'll explain why in a moment, but it does. And that excessive dietary fat will increase insulin because by causing insulin resistance, the pancreas responds by raising blood insulin. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. And whenever insulin comes up, it decreases, it makes insulin-like growth factor be elevated as well because it decreases the liver binding proteins for insulin-like growth factor. So you get elevated ILGF. ILGF is often called IGF as well. And that gets elevated, that accelerates cancer replication. These are important points, and these are controllable. That's why they're worth knowing. We talked about the estrogenic contributing to it, being sedentary, increasing cancer risk. Excessive dietary sodium to a lesser extent contributes. Dietary sweets are a minor issue, but what I'm saying is you want to spend more time in this phase, and that'll decrease your risk of cancer development and cancer progression. Okay, the big difference between a bacteria called prokaryotes and a eukaryote is everybody says it's the nucleus, but what it really means, the real point is the mitochondria. Mitochondria is where most energy is made. That matters. Typically, glucose comes into a cell, hexokinase type 1, will phosphorylate it, goes through glycolysis, gets converted to pyruvate, goes into mitochondria. Inside the mitochondrial matrix, there's Krebs cycle, okay? That's normal metabolism. In a cancer cell, you're going to have amplified numbers. It's called upregulation of glucose type 1 transporters. Now you'll get more glucose coming into the cell, and it'll go to pyruvate. But the unique thing about cancer is that it's going to pump a lot of that out of the cell in the form of lactate plus protons and cause an acidic environment around the cell. Krebs cycle will run often partly backwards, and it can be fed by glutamine, which is like the most common amino acid. And the point of this slide is some people think, well, I can lower my blood glucose and just control cancer in that way, like with a keto diet or something. And I'll tell you, in my opinion, after looking at this biochemistry quite a bit and trying to understand it, I don't think that's a good idea. Glutamine is able to feed these cancers coming in the back door of Krebs cycle. You'll have upregulated increased transporters for glutamine, facilitating its entry into the mitochondria. So you need to be aware of glutamine. Trust me, that's a major thing to understand in understanding approaches to cancer. Okay, now here's a little bit of a comparison of cells. We talked about a bacterial cell, and it might run anaerobically. That's just fine. Here's a normal cell. It runs aerobically. It uses oxygen in the mitochondria to make tons of ATP, and it's primarily a worker cell. Okay, but that's called oxidative metabolism. And now here's a major concept I'm going to share with you about cancer. When there's hypoxia, many cells will die because they can't make enough energy to meet their needs. But some cells will switch into an old-fashioned anaerobic mode of existence. And I believe this is a pathway that's sitting in everyone's DNA, but it just rarely gets activated. When these cells go into this activation pathway, they can run on primarily anaerobic metabolism. And this enables them to survive times of low oxygen called hypoxia. But a cancer cell, so what I'm saying is a cancer cell is not just some random mutation caused by a mutagenic chemical, for example. A cancer cell is a cell that transforms numerous genes and runs entirely changed pathways, basically so it can function in a hypoxic environment. It upregulates the number of plasma membrane fat transporters called CD36. It upregulates the receptors for iron. They're called transferrin receptors. It upregulates the glutamate transporters. It upregulates receptors for IGF. And this is what I would call IGF, insulin-like growth factor sensitization. Because it's got more receptors, a lot of people say, well, it won't hurt if I eat a little meat or have a little alcohol. In my opinion, that would be a stupid thing to do because you're going to have amplified receptors on the cell surface of the cancer. So you don't want to take a chance. It's going to be hypersensitive to just a little bit of alcohol or just a little bit of insulin-like growth factor. So the wise move, I've heard of a lot of people going low-fat vegan, improving their lifestyle, exercise and whatnot, managing the stress and doing pretty well with cancer, but then saying, oh, I'm fine. I don't even think it was the diet. And then going off the diet, and then they progressively get worse and it becomes irreversible and they die. So if it was me personally, I would not mess around. I would do everything as good as I can to minimize the likelihood of cancer growing. This is just showing what happens with a cancer. It'll typically get taken up by immune cells. They'll go into a lymph node. The lymph node, they'll try to activate other immune cells that can, let's say, form antibodies to the cancer, can form a T cell response to it, and they're going to ramp up the immune response to go remove all the micrometastases in the body. And so what the cancer cell was doing was it was pumping out those lactic acid protons to make the area surrounding the tumor acidic, because that paralyzes the immune system so that it can't do these other things of activating itself, multiplying the cells that are targeted to the cancer. So That's why things that cause acidosis tend to make cancers worse. And I believe, for example, sodium chloride is a problem. Everybody thinks the chloride's irrelevant. No, the chloride's relevant because when you increase chloride ions in the blood, you're going to displace bicarbonate ions, and it's going to cause a low-grade metabolic acidosis, which makes things worse. Meat also has a lot of sulfur-containing amino acids like cysteine and methionine, and those are partially degraded into sulfuric acid, again causing a low-grade metabolic acidosis, just favoring a more acidic peritumoral milieu, which you don't want. That's pro-cancerous. The biggest thing that changes in cancer in terms of metabolism is the previous hexokinase 1 for phosphorylating glucose gets converted into hexokinase 2. If you're curious to learn more about that, the best book on the subject is Tripping Over the Truth by Travis Christofferson. And this is really a big deal that you're not seeing one isolated mutation. You're seeing a transformation of a cell from an aerobic cell into a primarily anaerobic cell, and hexokinase 2 attaches to the mitochondrial membrane, attaches to the voltage-dependent anion channel, VDAC, and then that locks the outer mitochondrial membrane in place so that the permeability transition port cannot open, which prevents it from going into apoptosis, programmed cell death. Trust me, that's a big deal. That's what's happening in cancer. All right, so like we talked about, a normal cell is a worker. Imagine you have a cell that's in the liver. The liver cell has a job. It has to make bile. It has to detoxify things. It has to manage the blood glucose level. It has to break down glycogen when it needs to make glucose. It has to run gluconeogenesis. It has to sense the blood glucose level. It's pretty busy. Well, that takes tons of ATP. So the normal cell focuses on making ATP. A cancer cell is a cell that's kind of like, the Johnny Paycheck song, take this job and shove it. Basically, what's happened is it doesn't have enough oxygen. It says, you know what? I can't make enough ATP on this little amount of oxygen. Okay, I'm glad I'm not dead. I lucked out. I got my, hexokinase 2 attached to my mitochondria. Screw this. I'm going to go find an apartment somewhere else. You guys are on your own. I'll see you later. That's what a cancer cell does. It's like a renegade cell that says, screw this. I'm no longer going to be a worker. I'm moving out. I'm going to go live somewhere else. So the cancer cell has different priorities. It wants to, get out of Dodge. And then what it wants to do is make copies of itself. Okay, so it's focused on replication, biosynthesis. It wants to make more protein because a cell has to double itself in order for it to divide. It has to double its plasma membrane lipids, all of its proteins, all of its DNA. A human cell has 3.3 billion base pairs of DNA. So it's got to make 6.6 billion nucleotides. That's a lot of biosynthesis. So it doesn't care about working. It just wants to make copies of itself and grow. Okay, then the other thing too, that another example of something that supports the metabolic theory of cancer, and trust me, this is the fundamental thing to know about cancer, that the metabolic theory makes more sense than the mutational theory. If you take a normal cell, it divides. Here's its DNA in the nucleus, here's its mitochondria, and the normal cell, cytoplasm is a light green. So it divides, everything's normal. Here's a cancer cell. When a cancer cell divides, you produce a cancer cell. Now here's where it starts to get interesting. If the problem was primarily, let's say, a mutation within the DNA of the nucleus, they could put a cancer nucleus into a regular cell that's otherwise normal with the green here, and that cell will grow normally. So the point is that whatever's causing the cancer, it is not in the DNA of the nucleus, okay? But if you were to take the cytoplasm and mitochondria and then put normal DNA in there, it would be irrelevant. You'll get cancer. So the point is whatever is primarily causing the cancer is related to the mitochondria and the cytoplasm. And this guy, Thomas Seyfried, did brilliant research on metabolic theory of cancer. And he's a pretty famous guy. You can see his YouTube videos on the internet. He has a tendency sometimes to recommend ketogenic diet, which I personally don't agree with based on my study of the biochemistry. But did he do great work on mitochondrial theory? Yeah, he did. Okay. All right. Now here is a little bit more detail on metabolism. This is glycolysis in the cytoplasm. And these are all the reactions that go through to work towards getting more ATP rate made eventually in the mitochondria. These are the subsequent reactions in glycolysis. They run down this pathway and you end up with pyruvate. Usually the pyruvate has one, CO2, like right here, the carboxylic acid cleaved off, and it'll send acetyl-CoA, an acetate, that's 2-carbon molecule into the mitochondria. Okay, these are the standard pathways of life. All life is based on this. All right, so here's a mitochondria. Here's the outer mitochondrial membrane, typically abbreviated OMM. Here's the inner mitochondrial membrane, this green one right here, that's typically abbreviated IMM. And here is the intramembranous space. IMS is the abbreviation for that. In the center where Krebs cycle runs, that's the mitochondrial matrix. Okay, all of life runs on this, and mitochondria are like right in the center of everything. So it's good to have this basic stuff. It's worth knowing. Okay, so like we talked before, glucose coming down the pike, goes to pyruvate, a CO2 is chopped off from the carboxylic acid, goes to acetyl-CoA, acetyl-CoA goes in the Krebs cycle, and that runs in a circle. At each of these major steps, you're cleaving off two hydrogens. A hydrogen is just a proton and an electron. So these hydrogens are going to get pumped out of the matrix. These electrons are going to be passed down. It's kind of like a fireman bucket brigade. Okay, Krebs cycle, we don't need to get into that too much. Just being aware that you're also pulling off electrons. It's like a harvesting machine. What you're basically doing is you're harvesting these carbon bonds in the glucose, and you're converting them into electron transporters. So the electrons then are passed like a bucket brigade of firemen, the volunteer firemen, and they're passed from the weakest electron grabber to the strongest electron grabber. The strongest electron grabber is oxygen. Okay, and then the energy acquired by rolling these electrons downhill is used to pump protons out into the intermembranous space. Okay, and then the gradient is harvested at ATP synthase, where a proton is allowed to come back in to the mitochondrial matrix, and the ADP is converted to ATP. And this is how the human body produces energy. Using this mechanism in a mitochondria of oxidative phosphorylation, you can produce 18 times as much energy as you can in the cytoplasm by glycolysis alone. So that's why to be anaerobic is a big deal. 18 times less energy for the cell. That's also why things that injure the mitochondria tend to cause cells to die or transform into cancer. Okay, we show oxygen here in the periodic table of elements as being the most electronegative right here is F minus, and these are all the halogens right here. But right next to it is oxygen. It's the second most electronegative element in the whole periodic table. That's its electronegativity, meaning how much it wants to grab electrons. And that's why oxygen's like this electron grabber. It's super aggressive molecule. And that's why it's the acceptor in electron transport. So here's oxygen again, grabbing these electrons, and that's all part of how human metabolism works. All right. Now, normally, like I said, the electrons are passed down through these complexes, and then the proton over here is harvested at ATP synthase. All right. So sometimes you're going to leak electrons. Electrons will sometimes fall off a coenzyme Q. So coenzyme Q normally delivers electrons to complex 3. And this is, by the way, this is complex 1, complex 2, coenzyme Q, intramembranous transporter, complex 3, cytochrome C sitting on the outer leaflet of the inner mitochondrial membrane. That's a cardiolipin, fancy little phospholipid there. Here is complex 4, and here is ATP synthase. This is the inner mitochondrial membrane. This is what all human life is based on right here. And so what I'm saying is sometimes an electron will inadvertently leak off, and it'll hit an oxygen, and it'll become a superoxide free radical. And those are normally readily neutralized by superoxide dismutase, SOD, okay? And it'll get converted then into water, and it ends up not being a big deal. A little bit of that happens all day long, but this can become excessive. Excessive dietary fat will tend to cause problems right at the level of complex 3, and you get excessive electron leak. And there's other things that will do this as well. Okay, now here's something that's really big. I thought this was an amazing paper. As a matter of fact, I would say this is the most important thing you could know out of everything ever written or published about diabetes. The most important thing to know is that excessive dietary fat is the major risk factor for causing insulin resistance, and that the plasma membrane simply cannot control how much fat comes in. A fatty acid is typically a chain of carbons attached to a carboxylic acid, which is typically deprotonated at physiologic pH. However, when it interacts with the outer leaflet, let's say on a skeletal muscle cell, it can become protonated uncharged. Once it's uncharged, it's neutral. It can then enter the outer leaflet of this plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle cell and flip-flop to the inner leaflet and subsequently enter the cytoplasm. So this happens in a concentration gradient dependent fashion. The more fat in the blood, the more fat gets into that skeletal muscle. They tried inhibiting all the plasma membrane fatty acid transporters like CD36, and it made no difference. The fatty acids were diffusing into the cell based on their concentration in the blood. So that's a big deal. So what it means is you can't get around this. You just have to reduce dietary fat. If you got excessive dietary fat, you're going to be trending into insulin resistance, and you got to reduce dietary fat. There's no way around it that I'm aware of. Okay, now fatty acids. One thing to be aware of too is that they're what's called amphipathic. So hydrophilic means to love water, okay? And that would be something like an ion with a charge on it. Hydrophobic is like a chain of carbons where there's no charge on it, because the hydrogens bound to the carbons have a similar electrical properties, so that there ends up being no net electrical cloud to make them more soluble in water. So there's hydrophobic and hydrophilic, and these are soluble in oil. But there's some unique property of a fatty acid because it's got both. It's got a polar charged end and an unpolar hydrocarbon chain. And this is amphipathic, like an amphibian. An amphibian can live on land and water. And trust me, that ends up being a really big deal. All right, so remember that amphipathic has got a charged component and a non-charged component, and that's what all your detergents have, okay? And they're going to end up mostly being estrogenic. Emulsifiers have that too, and it's in a lot of soaps, because in a soap, you can pull the oily dirt on oneself into the water-soluble milieu and remove the chemical from your body. That's how a soap works, okay? And detergents work that way too. So these detergents are estrogenic. We're going to come back to that. All right, now here's what I wanted you to see. This is reality, because I have a lot of people, oh, I feel fine. Why can't I have, just a couple of drinks? Why can't I have hamburgers? Why can't I do this or that? And here's how I view things. These are common intermitochondrial membrane toxins. You'd be surprised how much mercury there is in food. Mercury is more common than people think in foods, especially things potentially related to corn. And there's other ways. I'm not going to be talking about mercury today, but people are exposed to more of it than they realize. If they've got dental amalgams, they're exposed to that. I actually read some interesting papers recently on dental amalgams. If a person holds their phone up to their face, they get a tiny increase in their amalgam, which becomes relevant if you're doing it all the time. Okay. Glyphosate is toxic to complex 2, cadmium to complex 3, atrazine to complex 3. Dietary fat, those are the most common thing people are exposed to, toxic to complex 3. Lead to cytochrome C over to ATP synthase, hydroxynonenal from lipid peroxidation with omega-6 ingestion, excessive amounts, F- right at complex 4. So the reason I'm showing you this is just to realize a lot of this is going on at a baseline, all the stuff that's damaging our mitochondria, and our body's great at healing, but you have to realize probably too, if you ate a lousy diet and had bad habits in the past, you've got more cell injury than you realize. Don't get me wrong. Mitochondria are good at repairing themselves. You can have mitochondrial autophagy where they remove the bad ones, keep the good ones. But I'll show you kind of how I would picture it. I don't know if I can move this here, but you see how the bull right here in the bullfight has got a couple wounds on himself, and he keeps on charging at the red cape. That reminds me of like when I talk to a patient. By the bullfighter, it's to symbolize metaphorically a sad diet and lifestyle that destroys people. And it happens because they're addicted. Oh, I love my hamburgers, my milk, my ice cream, just my wine, my cheese. And I'm saying, look, you can do whatever you want. It's your life. But I'm just telling you, ignorant return to all these bad habits, they progressively damage your health. And eventually, your health's gone. So if you want to keep your health long, don't be addicted to bad stuff, and don't have a passive attitude. I see lots of diabetics, they get over 50, especially over 60. And I'll tell them, like, I talk to these diabetics, they just got their foot amputated. And I'm like, you might want to consider a plant-based diet. They're like, oh, I'm doing okay at my age. What are you going to do? Or you want to take away my ice cream? And it's like, they don't even understand. They're dying. And there's similar processes. They got their foot amputated because they don't have blood flow to their toes. Similar things are happening in their brain. Okay, and they get this progressive dementia. So I like these poems here, like Dylan Thomas. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage against the dying of the light. And I like Dryden's quote. He says, I am wounded, but not slain. I will lie a while and bleed a little and then rise to fight again. So by that, I mean, yeah, we all made mistakes in the past. We all screwed up, but you learn from it and you say, well, now I'm going to do better. And I love the story of Ruth Heidrich. She got cancer. She was diagnosed with metastatic cancer, 42 years of age. She went and she talked to Dr. McDougall. He gave her all the reasons for becoming a vegan. She goes, I'll do it. She became a vegan on the spot. Okay. A very intelligent lady. And what I'm trying to say is that's intelligent behavior. You say, I screwed up. You admit the mistake. You try to learn what's better, and then you do what's better. And that is the path to success, to win the game of health. And it's doable because progressively over time, these changes just get worse. Here's a diabetes scenario. Here's normal blood flow. Red blood cells going through a capillary. Here's the capillary basement membrane. These are the endothelial cells, spindle shape, with a spindle shaped nucleus there. They're aligned in the direction of flow. Capillaries, about 5 microns. RBC is about 7 microns. So they got to divide, they got to, bend to form a little bit to get through there. And then they deliver oxygen to the tissue here. And then let's say this is to a nerve, but it could be any tissue in the body. What I'm saying is with hypertension and diabetes, this capillary basement membrane gets thicker and thicker over time, and less oxygen is delivered to the tissue. So what I'm saying is if you don't fix these problems, the sooner the better, they only get worse. You're going to have less and less oxygen delivered to tissue, more and more tissue hypoxia. That favors cancer growth. You don't want that. Yeah. So the same diet, low fat, low sodium vegan, that helps prevent, minimizes minimizes hypertension, minimizes diabetes. It's obvious. Okay, now here's something I thought was kind of funny. Let me just look at what time it is. All right. This is what's called the reverse Warburg effect. I talked to you about the Warburg effect. But there's a guy by the name of Santi. He's the guy who coined the name of reverse Varberg effect. And what he showed is that cancer cells are basically taking over their surrounding environment. They paralyze the immune system by throwing lactic acid on it. And then they also will paralyze and they'll take over the surrounding fibroblasts. And they actually will force them to digest themselves and produce energy for the cancer cell. And they're producing ketones. And that's why I don't believe in this ketone body. Lisanti will tell you, he's got a lecture online. You can watch it. The reverse Varberg effect means that cancer cells are feeding on ketones. I don't think a ketone diet's a good, based on my understanding of the biochemistry, I don't think it's a good idea. A lot of people think it is. I do not. And cancer, like I said, it's sort of paralyzing the immune system by the high acidity in its environment. And then it's almost like it uses reactive oxygen species, typically initiated with hydrogen peroxide, it's like an electric cattle prod to force this means cancer-associated fibroblasts, to force them to do its will, which means digest themselves to give the cancer cell energy. It's a very brutal thing. And then it eats them like a cannibal. So cancer is pretty tough, rough, mean stuff. So it's good to know what you could do to help minimize it, because the cancer will hang out. It's almost like a gang of thugs. They hang out in the tumor, and they have a surrounding what's called a tumor milieu, tumor microenvironment. And the cancer stem cells are relatively protected, and they divide at a very slow rate. That's why it's very hard to remove them with chemotherapy, because they're dividing so slow. They're not that affected by chemotherapy quite often. And they're also quite often able to pump the chemotherapy out of their cytoplasm, so it doesn't affect them so much. And that's why a lot of people will hear something like, well, you had a good response to chemotherapy, but that's not the same thing as being cured. Response means that the tumor has shrunk in size. It does not mean the patient is cured. A lot of times the cancer then comes back more aggressively and metastasizes, because it'll only be cured if the stem cells are removed. Now, there's some cancers like testicular carcinoma that does respond really well to chemotherapy. And the classic story is Lance Armstrong. He not only had metastatic testicular cancer treated with chemo, but he made an incredible recovery, went on to win the Tour de France. But a lot of other cancers, it does not effectively treat the stem cells. And that's worth knowing. So look, one of the questions I would ask, let's say I had cancer, because I'm talking about what would I do? I would find out, does chemotherapy effectively treat the stem cells? Because if it doesn't, there's a very high risk it's going to recur and be fatal. So that's a big deal. And then do you really want that chemotherapy? It's going to suppress your immune system if it can't remove the stem cells. Is it really worth it? I would seriously ask myself that question. Okay, now I'm going to get into some of this. What would I do if I had cancer before? And then after, as soon as I just got a couple slides here on this, then I'm going to talk about the estrogens. Okay. So it all kind of goes together. Okay, the guiding principle that shapes all my decision is, and this is just for me, I'm not telling anybody else to do this. I'm saying this is based on my extensive study of biochemistry and nutritional effects on cancer, what seems to me rational. And I'm very impressed by the recovery of Ruth Heidrich from metastatic cancer. I'm very impressed by Janet Marie Wakelin. I left some of the books down here. So if anybody wants to read these things, we talk about China Study, T. Colin Campbell, Estrogeneration book by Anthony J., Senior Health by Ruth Heidrich, Undo It study by Dean Ornish is very good. And he did the big experiment showing that persons who took on a vegetarian diet with some exercise and stress reduction were able to keep their PSAs the same or lower them and had more favorable histology upon repeat biopsy. They were all biopsy-proven cancer patients. So that's his book, and he writes about it in there. Raw Cures Cancer is a book by Janet Murray Wakelin, and she had metastatic cancer about 20 years ago. She's still alive. And to sort of celebrate her recovery, she literally ran 365 marathons, a marathon every day, all around the perimeter of Australia. And what I'm saying is, look at that incredible fitness. Okay, Ruth Heidrich, when she was told that she had metastatic breast cancer, she's dead in 6 months, they told her to make a will. She said, you know what, I think I'm going to run a marathon. Okay. So tremendous exercise. You're going to push yourself into energy depletion transiently, elevate the AMPK pathway. You're going to shut off mTOR. That's a very good thing. Also, just like you've got veins everywhere in your body, you got lymphatics. And when you exercise, you squeeze the muscles and you pump the lymphatics, which means you speed your white blood cells to travel all over your body for surveillance of your body to subsequently remove the cancer cells. So exercise is a great thing for helping to prevent cancer. So I've seen that as a common pattern, a lot of exercise in people. This lady also made an excellent recovery. And this one too wrote an excellent book on estrogen chemistry. That's a little more like a textbook, whereas this one is more of just a fun book. Okay, getting back to this. Would I get a biopsy? Now you have to remember, one of the things I do is I'm a general radiologist, neuroradiologist, interventional radiologist. I've seen many thousands and thousands of cancers. I know if a patient has cancer or not. I don't need a biopsy. So then you would say, well, why do they do biopsies? The reason they do biopsies is there's different types of cancer. If you're going to get chemotherapy, which most patients do, you're going to want to know the subtype. that becomes a big deal. But if I was just going to treat myself and not get chemo, I don't think I would do a biopsy because I already know it's cancer. I don't really care what type it is. I'm going to do the same thing anyways. So I wouldn't do it. What's the risk of it spreading? Probably pretty small, but I don't know for sure. So I wouldn't do it. Okay. If you're going to get chemo though, you definitely got to do it. All right. What's the cancer's doubling time? Let's say it's going to have a doubling time of 100 days and it takes 25 years to kill you. Well, if I could slow it down by 50%, it'll kill me in 50 years. And, I'll be real old by then. Who cares? I'll die of something else by then, old age by then. All right. Oh, we talked about how plant foods tend to be very low in leucine, unlike animal foods, very high in leucine, and that activates mTOR, stimulates cell replication. Meat, for example, is very fat, and the fat stimulates type 2 diabetes, which increases insulin-like growth factor and insulin. Those cause increased cancer growth. That's why I forget about meat. I mean, if you know anything about nutritional biochemistry with regard to cancer, you don't want to have another bite of meat the rest of your life, in my opinion. Okay, and we talked about the AMP pathway. If anybody wants to look about that with regard to exercise, slowing things down. Under conditions of energy stress, AMPK inhibits mTOR. Okay, that's what you want to know. That's big stuff. All right, again, if I had cancer, what would I do? Would I get surgery? Well, it depends. Okay, like for breast cancer, Dr. McDougall says he likes a lumpectomy for local tumor control so you don't have a messy problem on your chest. You might need it in that context. But, if I had a bowel obstruction, I would probably get surgery because I'd want to be able to eat. But it would depend in other situations. I would really want to know, will this dramatically improve my survival? If not, why do it? Because like I talked about that rabbit of a cancer, there's a good chance that rabbit has micrometastases. He's got babies on the other side of the fence and has a tunnel underneath the fence that you don't even know about. And those little babies are coming back in and they're eating up the carrots you got growing along the inner wall of the fence. So what I'm saying is you probably got micrometastases. I would focus on building up my immune system to be as strong as possible. And that seems to be the pattern I've seen in the patients who've done really well. For example, if you look at that book, I forgot to mention, I mentioned in my other lecture, I just recently gave a lecture on If I Had Cancer, What Would I Do?, where I went through a lot more detail on the books. I went through Radical Remission by Kelly Turner. And basically she said, what are the common things that all the survivors of incredibly good survivals relative to prognosis did? And almost all of them, they go as close to low-fat vegan as possible. They might not go 100% low-fat vegan, but I would personally go 100% because you don't know how much it's going to take to give you survival. All right, so I would do it. They also manage their stress, have an attitude of gratitude, exercise if they can, if they're not too sick. Okay, what about chemo? We pretty much talked about chemo. It would have to give me a very high survival rate, like 40% or more benefit before I would do it. I don't believe in 10%, 20%. In my experience, the benefits tend to be exaggerated a little bit. The side effects tend to be underestimated a little bit. So a really big benefit's usually obvious, okay? Like when you go plant-based, low-fat vegan, your risk of coronary artery disease drops like a rock, okay? That's a real benefit. Somebody who tells you, well, this pill will give you a 5% reduction, I would say, yeah, right. It's probably going to give you a 10% increase in some side effects, so I wouldn't go with that. What about radiation? It would depend. Almost everybody gets referred to an oncologist, so the oncologist sees a much wider variety of patients. Radiation is usually a limited, specialized group of patients that have been pre-selected. What's my rationale for these thoughts? I ask myself, what causes cancer? And I think the dominant cause is tissue hypoxia. There's secondary causes that contribute to it, like tissue injury. But for example, let's say you have an infection. The infection creates a lot of inflammation, subsequent scar tissue fibrosis. Let's say you've got hepatitis B of the liver. You'll get liver fibrosis. The fibrosis in the liver deposits a lot of collagen. That collagen then will cause hypoxia of the cells trapped within it. Same thing when you inhale asbestos into your lungs. So what I'm saying is hepatitis B can still cause cancer through a hypoxia mechanism. Asbestos inhalation into the lungs can cause cancer, like a mesothelioma, through a hypoxia mechanism. All right. So I want to prevent hypoxia. How do you prevent hypoxia? Same old story. Low fat, low sodium, vegan diet. All right. And then these secondary things, I'm going to minimize my dietary iron. So I'll minimize my oxidative stress. A cancer needs iron to grow. You minimize excessive bodily iron, you make it harder for cancer to grow. It needs a lot of fat. Okay. So you minimize that. And then the big thing is drop that leucine down by avoiding all the meat animal foods. And you then can turn down mTOR. That's what you want to do. And you want to turn down insulin. You want to turn down insulin like growth factor. Carbohydrate diet is the best way to do that. Okay, we talked about minimizing tumor promoters. We talked about T. Colin Campbell's work where he showed you drop animal protein less than 5%, he could stop the growth in tumors in rodents. I'll come back to that in just a moment, though. There's one other key point I think is important about that. T. Colin Campbell was doing what I would describe as monoprotein sources. Okay, in this animal, we only give them casein from milk. And this animal, we only give them gluten, let's say from wheat or other grains. And this animal, we give them soy protein. Okay, that's fine. But in reality, we don't eat one source of protein only. We eat a variety of protein. In general, plant proteins are lower in leucine. But I would probably reduce my overall dietary protein intake because, one of the things T. Colin Campbell writes about too, he says, well, you don't have to worry about vegans being low in protein because by eating a variety of sources, they get enough of everything they need. So what I'm saying is I don't want the cancer to get enough of everything it wants. So by reducing my total protein intake, I think that might be useful. So I would probably minimize my intake of beans in general. Now, not everybody would agree to that. And people tell you people eating beans survive longer. I'm saying, well, maybe, but if I had cancer, I would want to really drop my protein availability to shut down my mTOR as best I could. That's what I personally would do. And that's the reason for it. And there's a guy by the name of, I think it's J.R. Mitchell, PhD, who wrote some papers about, he believes that total protein intake is even more effective than caloric restriction to slow down aging. I'm not positive that that's been replicated in other studies and confirmed, but it was pretty impressive, the evidence I saw to that effect. What else would I be aware of? We talked about the benefit of lowering sodium chloride because the sodium is a vasoconstrictor and the chloride contributes to a mild acidosis, which is pro-cancerous in the tumor milieu. What else would I do? I think when you eat carbs, carbohydrate, starch diet, you get a small increase in blood glucose postprandial after eating. But if you eat fat first, causing insulin resistance, you lower your carbohydrate tolerance, you get a more prolonged higher blood glucose spike. So what I'm actually saying, paradoxically, it is by eating carbohydrates. Starch is a polymer of glucose, and it's like a slow release energy pill because the gut has to peel off the fiber before the glucose is absorbed through the intestinal lining into the blood. You get a more normal blood glucose level and you'll use less insulin. You look at all these diabetics, look at these guys, look at those mastering diabetes guys, two real smart guys, Bobby Bitteroo and Cyrus Wambata. Okay. When they eat carbohydrate diet, they lower their insulin need. Okay. That's my point. When you lower that insulin need, you make life more difficult for your cancer cell. Insulin's a growth factor for cancer. So by lowering insulin resistance, you make it harder for cancer to grow. That's what I want to do. We talked about all the benefit of all the exercise, slowing down mTOR. We talked about minimizing the amount of leucine in your diet or reducing protein intake. And we talk about how our diet is not a mono source of protein. It's multiple different things. Oil is a major tumor promoter. Forget about oil. And the processing of it causes all kinds of problems. I accidentally moved the slide, but the way it's processed, it'll secondarily often be rancid. It has lipid peroxidation, contribute to insulin resistance. You don't want it. You don't want any oil. And then there's the whole hypoxia. It causes hypoxia, blood sludge. I talked about that in other lectures. It's not a good thing for a patient with cancer. It's not a good thing for anybody anyways. There is some benefit to eating raw fruits. I think that a lot of the healthiest people I've seen eat a lot of raw fruits and vegetables. So I would definitely make sure a lot of these cancer patients like Ruth Heidrich, Chris Wark, they eat these giant bowls of salad. She likes to start off her meal with salad. Chef AJ recommends that too. I think that's a good idea because if you don't eat that salad first, you might not eat any, and you might only eat a little bit of salad rather than eat a lot of salad. It's probably a good habit to eat that first. Let's see, what else? I would never eat processed foods. They're so full of toxic preservatives. You don't even realize how toxic there is and how many of these things are. That's a topic for another day, but just trust me, zero processed foods. Get as close to that as you can. One special day, a holiday, maybe you go out to a restaurant. What you do one day is not the big a deal. It's what you do every day, but keep it to a minimum. No alcohol. It's a tumor promoter. There's nothing good about alcohol. Forget all this soda pop, all this stuff, because when you start looking at it, it'll get worse and worse. Okay, let's look at the soda pop. You got an aluminum can, you get aluminum in your food, metalloestrogen. The can's going to be lined with BPA, bisphenol A. That's estrogenic plastic. All right. It's not going to be good for you. High fructose corn syrup, sometimes that's contaminated with mercury. It comes from corn that's been sprayed with atrazine. That's estrogenic too. So it's just going to get worse. All right. What else? Best water is usually well water that there's no fracking or other chemical pollutants in the area. You want a whole house carbon filter because that'll remove estrogenic chemicals. So that's for your entire house. I don't know how much they cost nowadays. They used to cost about $1,400. Maybe you can get them cheaper now. If I had cancer though, I would want that. If it was an estrogenic cancer, certainly. Kitchen reverse osmosis filter, put that one under the sink. You can get them on countertop. That'll get all the estrogenics out of your water. I typically eat a little food before I drink from reverse osmosis. All right, staying warm. I think sweating a little bit helps to detoxify the body. I like to be warm. Mitochondria work better. Get your sunshine because then you get more activated vitamin D3. It's a lot healthier than taking pills. I wouldn't take vitamin D pills. I would get my sunshine. It'll also increase nitric oxide throughout your body. That guy at MedCram has a good lecture on sunshine. I like that, the MedCram guy. All right, Roger Seaholt or something, Dr. Roger Seaholt, he has a good lecture on sunshine. Okay, activated vitamin D improves function. We talked about that. Maintain good social relationships. That lowers your stress, so your immune system functions better and it makes life more enjoyable. Helping other people. I think we get like reward neurotransmitters released in our brain when we help other people, because biologically, I think that increases our likelihood to survive in the wild. And that, for an animal to survive in the wild, us, humans, the talking primates, we're more than a talking primate, but we're at least that. I think that gets us to behave in a way that we help each other and we just enjoy it, and it's good for everybody. So that makes you healthier. Have some type of purpose. Like I said, my mom lived about 11 years when she had a prognosis, only living 2 or 3. And I think because she did all these other social, psychological things right and exercise. And, I didn't know nutrition at the time. I wish I did. For a lot of people, religion can really help them a lot. Religious people are the healthiest people in the world. Look at all the blue zones with Dan Buettner, National Geographic. Whatever soothes you, your music, spending time with people you like. All that stuff is good. Having an attitude of gratitude. Chris Wark is really good when he talks and writes about that sort of thing. We're talking about what else is the bottom line on cancer, the irreducible minimum. Most cancers are turtles, so I do not screen for stuff. What I do is I try to lower my pre-test risk factor so low that the screen would be ridiculous, because you would be more likely to find a false positive or a turtle, and you don't want to be working that up. So that's what I like to do. Most people think of, cancer screening as like playing the lottery. Well, maybe I'll win and be saved from cancer, but they don't realize there's more risk in cancer screening than there is in playing the lottery. They got the risk of being stuck in a workup for a false positive for years, and potentially that being rather expensive, even painful if you have to undergo unnecessary procedures, or you get diagnosed with a turtle and nobody knows if it's a turtle or a rabbit at first, and you get treated like it's a rabbit. You might have a lot of side effects from that treatment. Okay. So me personally, I got 30 years experience with that. I try to lower my risk. And if a person is not willing to do that, and most people are not, then let them go for all that stuff. But me, I like to, I don't want to be cut open. I don't want to be put on a bunch of drugs. So the only way you can avoid ending up on a bunch of drugs or being cut open is this whole low-fat vegan stuff. I'm just glad it exists. I'm grateful for it. I wish there was some other way. I wish there was some fun way. Get drunk every night. And I hate drinking. I think alcohol is a brain poison. But what I'm saying is, there's no other way that I'm aware of than doing this, because I think that's what humans are designed to do. Okay. Let's see what else here. We talked about that. You always got to keep that in mind. Somatic mutation theory, I think, has been disproven. The metabolic theory of cancer, I think, is the correct one, and it tells you what to do. So what this also means, though, is for most cancers, conventional medicine, in my opinion, really is not going to do that much. It can cure you of testicular cancer and a couple other cancers. That's great. It can really help you in a lot of situations. But what I'm trying to say is, most people, from what I can tell, the main determinant of whether or not they live a long time or they die is based on what they do, how they eat, whether or not they exercise, how they manage their stress, and these other things. Okay. So once you realize, now a lot of people tell me, oh, how could you say that? Well, I actually kind of like this situation in the sense that it puts me in charge of myself. And so once I realize that no one can really save me, I have to save myself, then I'm motivated to learn what it takes and to do it. So it empowers the individual. So I think that's a good thing. Okay, that pretty much summarizes what I would do if I had cancer and what you could do. About how much time do I have left?
You can have, almost as much time as you want. Okay. So it's.
Yeah, you tell me when to stop. But now that was part 1 of the talk. Okay, this is part 2.
If you have time, there are some questions. So please continue if you like.
Yeah, whatever you want. I got some interesting stuff about estrogen. I found estrogen chemistry sort of fascinating because I really didn't know hardly anything about it. Doctors don't learn about this in med school and residency. And then I wanted to keep my testosterone high. I wanted to be strong. My sons are getting strong. They lift weights and they make fun of me for being a weak old man, but I'm stronger than anyways, we won't get into all that. But so I wanted to make sure my testosterone's good and et cetera. And anyways, so I started reading about estrogen chemistry. I'm like, oh my goodness, there is so, and by the way, again, this is the best book, Estrogeneration. Trust me, you get started in estrogen, you read that book and it'll be the gateway to understand all the more advanced stuff. I said, Mendeleev was the chemist who started having like little cards, like baseball cards of all the elements. And he started putting them in order and he created the periodic table of elements. And I'm like, I could do the same thing with estrogen. So I started collecting all the estrogens, and here's the ones that come from food and plants, or, from the cooking devices for eating food and plants. Here's the one that come from personal care products like deodorant. Here's the one that come from herbicides and pesticides. Here's the one from detergents and soaps. Here's the one from miscellaneous sources. And what I'm saying is, you don't even realize it, but you could be exposed to 50 of these in one day. And so what you want to do is learn what they are and avoid them. I can also tell you, what did I end up doing once I learned all this stuff? I was already pretty much of a minimalist. but I became more of a minimalist once I understood, for example, I only eat organic food because I want to avoid, I certainly wouldn't eat ever, if I could, eat anything non-organic that had corn in it or that had soy in it that was non-organic, because then you're got a high risk of being exposed to GMO sprayed atrazine or glyphosate, and those are both estrogenic. They're thought to be both estrogenic. Estrogen strongly, and glyphosate is thought to. I've read that in a bunch of different sources. So right there, sunscreen. Like the average person says, oh, you're going out in the sun, you have to put sunscreen on. And I've been told many times in my life, I'm weird or I'm a jerk because I don't believe in sunscreen. I said right from the beginning, there's like all these chemicals in this. A lot of these look toxic to me. I didn't even realize they're estrogenic originally, but I just instinctively, I was a chem minor at Stanford. I ended up dropping chemistry. I didn't finish my chem minor because I didn't like the smell when I went into advanced synthetic lab. But I always been in love with chemistry. When I was a medical student, it was like biochemistry is the language of God. If I learn this, I'll be a better doctor. So I loved it. Okay, I was great at biochemistry, and I was just found it fascinating. So anyways, the reason I tell you all that is I've always been afraid of chemicals. Most people are not afraid of chemicals. They're instinctively afraid of a spider. They're instinctively afraid of a snake, but they're oblivious to chemicals. I see people all the time working with powerful chemicals, cleaning chemicals or other chemicals, and they don't even have the door or the window open. That is not smart. So sunscreen, here's what I'm saying. I think a lot of these chemicals are probably more likely to cause cancer than protect you from cancer, because so many of them are estrogenic, transdermally absorbed. And believe me, that's been shown. There was a JAMA article not that many years ago showing high levels of these estrogenic chemicals in the blood days later. And then sometimes these chemicals will get absorbed into the fat and they'll stick around a long time. So anyways, I just wanted to get a sense from this periodic table of estrogenics that there's a ton of them that people are being exposed to. And it's even things you would not think. Like I said, metalloestrogens like aluminum. It's thought that lead and mercury are also partially estrogenic indirectly. All right. Who would have guessed that? The MJ over here, marijuana, is estrogenic. Okay. A lot of times they'll feed moldy grains to some of these cattle, and they could get the Zea, and that is an estrogen from the mold. All right. They're in tons of things. They're in almost all these cosmetic products. I don't use any cosmetic products. I mean, the only thing I use is soap. Anyways, we'll get into some more of that later. What do estrogens do? Estrogens increase when a woman is pregnant, and they basically do a few things to help her get ready to have a baby. They help maintain bone mass because the baby might need the minerals from the bone. They help the woman to gain weight because that weight is energy that might be needed by the baby. In the old days, everybody's afraid of starving to death. So estrogen is a fat storage hormone. It's also called an obesogen. It causes proliferation of the breast tissue. That's normal when the breast first develop. That's called phalark, breast puberty. They make milk when there's a baby. Excessive estrogen can stimulate breast proliferation when you don't want it. You can get fibrocystic disease, fibroadenomas, and then breast cancer. About 80% of breast cancers are estrogen sensitive. It causes increased growth of the uterus. The uterine lining is endometrium. The muscle is the myometrium. Has them both grow. Menstruation onset is called menarche. Excessive estrogen is associated with heavy periods, PMS, cramps, increased risk endometriosis, fibroids, endometrial cancer. And that's what I meant about all those women getting hysterectomies. I think it's because they were drinking tap water, tons of estrogen. They were eating meat, lots of estrogen. And they eat the meat and processed food diet, so they're constipated. And they got the meat and processed food gut flora, which deconjugates the gut excreted estrogen from the liver. It has a glucuronidase enzyme. Typically, what happens is your body takes estrogen into the liver and it conjugates it with glucuronic acid. It's like a glucose with a carboxylic acid. And then it goes into your gut and you defecate it out. That's how you lower your body stores of estrogen. But the meat and processed food gut flora are different bacteria, and they have an increased amount of an enzyme called glucuronidase, and that will cleave off the glucuronic acid from the estrogen. Once it's unconjugated, it'll be reabsorbed in the body. So that's why they have higher estrogen levels. Plus, they want to fatten up the cattle. So they give them a lot of estrogen to fatten up the cattle. And then when you eat it, you get all that estrogen. Okay. I listed some other books here if you want to read about more details of estrogen chemistry. Neil Bernard wrote a nice book about your body in balance. That's good on hormonal issues. If you want more advanced endocrine chemistry and environmental chemistry, this is a good book. So there's a lot of good stuff. Okay, what else do estrogens do? A lot of these endocrine disruptors, they cause thyroid dysfunction. So that's a problem. The birth control pills EE2, ethinyl estradiol, so high estrogenic levels are associated with infertility and ovulation. When the estrogen levels are high, the body thinks it's already pregnant. So why would it bother to ovulate? It doesn't. Okay. Also, it has a confusing effect upon the immune system. Having a baby is like having a transplant, and you don't want the body to reject the transplant. So it'll suppress the immune system in terms of, so it doesn't remove the baby, so to speak. But the problem is it's almost like a little bit of a schizophrenic effect on the immune system, meaning that it'll become hyperactive in some ways, or a bipolar effect, you might call it, but hypoeffective in other ways. And it's hard to predict that. But women have about 80% of autoimmune disease, much more common in women than men. So your body's pretty good at doing what it's supposed to if you feed it the correct way, but you confuse your body when it's exposed to all these chemicals. And that's why I try to keep these chemicals to a minimum. They also make the blood more prothrombotic, increasing the risk of deep vein thrombosis, let's say in the leg. I've seen that in pregnant and in young women on birth control pills, but increased clots. You don't want clots forming in your body, increase your risk of myocardial infarction. A lot more women die from heart attacks, myocardial infarction, than they do from breast cancer. Everybody's just more scared of breast cancer because it can happen even when you're young and all the suffering to go with chemo. Okay, it's kind of like, all right, elevated estrogen in males associated with man boobs, moobs, gynecomastia. Also, here's a weird thing. High estrogen levels in men, they kind of have a different effect on men than women. On men especially, they have a tendency to make them apathetic. And that's thought to be part of the reason why there's much fewer men in college than there used to be. Nowadays, more than 60% of the college students are women, okay? And it's thought to be in part, that's multifactorial, but in part due to men being slightly apathetic. It causes growth of the male prostate, proliferation of prostate cells, and increased risk of prostate cancer. Okay, and here's something called the estrogenic principle. This is one put forth by Anthony J. Basically, if something's estrogenic, it'll do what other estrogenic chemicals do and can cause other problems that they cause. So that's why once you kind of know what estrogen does, you can predict what a lot of these estrogenic chemicals are going to do. Now, there's two types of estrogen receptors. There's the estrogen receptor alpha, and that's the one that causes the sex organs to grow, the breasts to grow, the Virginia to develop, the uterus, all that. Okay. Now, the estrogen receptor beta, that's more like the one that does other things in the body. Okay. There's a lot of other jobs that estrogen has that are part of being a woman and also, et cetera. Okay. We'll just leave it at that. And the estrogen B, remember B for beautiful. That's the good one. Okay. And then you're going to hear ER alpha, I think for A for being, ASS. Okay. A bad one in a sense, because that's the one that's thought to be the big risk factor for cancer. That's going to come up later. The main types of estrogen in the body are estradiol, which in the diol, di means two, OL is OL like a hydroxyl group. And that's the most powerful, most common estrogen you think of, especially in a premenopausal woman. Estrone has one hydroxyl group on, so that's called E1. Estradiol, by the way, is called E2. Estriol is called E3. You got three hydroxy groups on it. Okay. Now, here's something a little weird about a steroid hormone. Like all steroids, they can cross right across the plasma membrane, and they don't need a transport protein. Well, guess what? We just talked about fatty acids being able to do that in some circumstances. They're also amphiphilic. We'll look at their chemical structure here in a moment, but this amphiphilicity, it's a major important thing. Okay, we talked about normal estrogen levels being in the body about 20 to 40 picograms per ml in a woman's menstrual cycle. She's varying from 20 to 400, whereas a man stays fixed at 20. And this is highly relevant because these estrogenic chemicals, so you're 20 to 40 are your normal estrogen, right? These chemical exposures, you could be 10,000. You could be off the charts. So that's why even if something they go, well, it's only a weak estrogenic chemical. No, I would still be worried about that because you get that thing, 100, 1,000 times higher than your normal estrogen. It can take over the estrogen receptor and cause all these effects you don't want. Plus, a person's not exposed to one estrogen at a time. They're exposed to a bunch of them. They can expose to simultaneously BPA, bisphenol A in the plastics, simultaneously phthalates in the plastics, parabenzoic acid preservatives, phytoestrogens like we spoke about before in these foods, atrazine, the herbicide, GP, the herbicide, et cetera. So you're going to have multiple acting together. They can be synergistic, so that they augment each other. All right. So that's why you can have such a big estrogenic effect. Okay. And look how common ethinyl estradiol is, the birth control pill estrogen. About 60% of married women are taking that, and then they urinate that out into the water. Municipal filtration often doesn't remove it. So if a man drinks a cup of tap water, there's a very good chance that he's drinking some of a woman's birth control pills. All right. And these will decrease his testosterone. All right. Let's see what else is on. Estrogens tend to activate something called the PPAR gamma receptor related to fat storage in the body. And it's been described by some as a fat switch. And so by activating this, it causes her to gain more weight. The body thinks it's pregnant. Store weight for the baby, might need that for energy. Okay, we talked about causing increased growth of the uterus, the myometrium, muscle layer, and women often needing hysterectomies with chronically high estrogens. Increased bleeding from the uterus with the periods, prolonged menstrual periods, infertility because high estrogens doesn't ovulate. More morning sickness in pregnancy, more menopausal symptoms from high estrogens. You know, it's been talked about that the Asian women in the past, when they ate the primarily rice and plant-based diets, they wouldn't even have anything happen at menopause other than to just stop having periods, versus women in Western society with a lot of estrogen exposures through a meat diet and whatnot, they're more likely to have postmenopausal hot flashes and other symptoms. If the woman is pregnant and exposed to a lot of estrogen, the baby's more likely to have deformities, for example, the penis, deformity of the penis, hypospadias, or cryptorchidism, undescended testicles. Okay, so these are just some of the things that happen. Okay, this is just a picture. You know, again, all these estrogenic potential problems: more morning sickness, postpartum depression, hypothyroidism. Here's breast cancer, upper outer quadrant. And this going here, like I said, used to be about 30% back in the 1920s. Now it's about 60% upper outer quadrant. And that's thought related to using excessive deodorants and shaving the armpits, causing increased transdermal absorption of both the aluminum in the deodorant and the preservatives like benzoic acids, and then the shared lymphatics between the breast and the lymphatics of the armpit. Okay, we talked about fibroids, endometriosis. So this is just a repeat showing it in a pictorial form. And there's the cryptorchidism, testicle, and hypospadias of the penis and the baby. One other thing happens is a person can get themselves into a vicious cycle. These estrogens make themselves fatter, and then the estrogenic chemicals will accumulate in their fat, and their fat will have more aromatase enzyme, which converts testosterone into estrogen, which causes them to get fatter. So you see what I'm saying is you have to break the cycle, or you're just going to keep on getting fatter and sicker. And so you want to reduce your exposure to these estrogens. You want to reduce your dietary fat intake, or you can just get in this vicious cycle. Most of the fat people I know, they sort of given up on themselves and they never lose the weight. They're fat forever. They just get fatter and sicker, and it's sad. And I know, because like they'll come ask me things like, oh, you know, do you think I need back surgery? And I'm like, the best thing you could do to help minimize your back pain would be optimize your body weight. And sometimes they get real offended if I talk like that, and it's hard to have a conversation with. They want someone to come save them with a big surgery or something like that. But the reality is they'd be a lot better off if they learned how to save themselves by this nutrition and health stuff. Okay, we're going to go through some real simple chemistry about estrogen. It's based on a cholesterol. Cholesterol backbone structure has 4 rings, the A, B, C, and D rings. Okay, here's a hydroxyl group coming off the cholesterol. Notice the polarity here. It's polar in the sense that the hydroxyl group will have a little bit of a charge on the oxygen, but the rest of this carbon skeleton is non-polar. So this is hydrophilic, this is hydrophobic. So it tends to be amphiphilic, being, you know, both polar and non-polar. And this enables it to cross the plasma membrane. It's very much like a fatty acid, okay? And now here is estradiol. Again, it's amphiphilic. It has this non-charged carbon skeleton, and it has a hydroxyl here. The unique thing, this is really unique about estrogens. Here's the big thing, you got to know this. There's an aromatic ring, which means that there's 6 carbons here, a cyclohexane with 3 double bonds. That's called a benzene ring. And these double bonds, they're not fixed. They move around, and they allow those electrons, called the pi electrons, to run between the different carbons in the shared pi orbitals. What that means is when you have an aromatic ring on a chemical, you tend to have tremendous shelf life stability. So imagine you're a chemical company. You want to make money. You don't make money if your product spoils quickly on the shelf. So you want this good long-term shelf stability. Okay, aromatic ring has a little bit of a smell to it. So that comes from that a lot of them in chemistry, they smell kind of good. And the benzene is like the typical prefix. You'll see benzyl. They're also often going to be called phenols because here, I'll move this thing out of the way. A phenol is what it's called when you have both the benzene ring and the hydroxyl group on it. That's called a phenol. And the abbreviation for the group is phenyl. So you're going to see the words benzyl and phenyl all the time in aromatic chemicals. Like if you're trying to buy a product in a store, you see benzyl or phenyl on there, that's estrogenic. You probably don't want that product. Okay, well, anyways, you got to know this. This is good shelf life from the aromatic ring, and this hydroxyl group coming off here is antimicrobial. And this is what sits in that estrogen receptor, okay? So imagine this is the estrogen chemical coming in. The estrogen receptor is going to form a hydrogen bond with this hydroxyl group, and that's what will activate the estrogen receptor. It actually goes through the plasma membrane first, and then it goes into the cell. And I think that's an important point. These amphiphilic things can sometimes travel right through plasma membranes and get into cells and damage them. It's important to know that concept of amphiphilicity. Here is an estrogen molecule binding the estrogen receptor, all right? And you've got the hydroxyl group right here, and it's forming a hydrogen bond, with this hydrogen shared between the active site within the protein. All right. So anything that has a benzene ring and a hydroxyl group on it is typically going to activate the estrogen receptor. The enzyme binding site is relatively capacious outside of the spot for the benzene ring and the hydroxyl group. So a lot of different things sitting around here, the tail, if you will, of the phenol group can interact with the estrogen receptor. And that's why, I'll joke, it's almost promiscuous. Okay. It's like a slut, if you will. The estrogen receptor will be activated by tons of different things. Hundreds of chemicals can activate that estrogen receptor. And I think that's because evolutionarily, biologically, for all the thousands or more years humans have been on this planet, there was not any competition. But nowadays, with all these industrially produced chemicals, they're taking advantage of this estrogen receptor. Okay, and I just want to show you how these tricks work, because people get tricked by this one a lot. This is bisphenol A. Bis in chemistry means two. And phenol is, we said, a benzene ring with hydroxyl group. So there's two phenols, a phenol right here and a phenol right here. So bisphenol means two phenols, subtype A. All right, and now a lot of people have learned that bisphenol A, it's used in all these plastics, in baby bottles and all kinds of plastics. It was used in some water bottles. They've learned that it's very estrogenic and it's toxic. It reduces sperm counts. It causes all kinds of estrogenic problems in women. So once everybody learned, they go, oh, yeah, we have to ban BPA, ban BPA. And you know what the chemical company says? Yeah, okay, fine, we'll ban it. No big deal. What does the chemical company do? They just substitute out the middle group. They put a sulfate in there. They call it BPS. So what I'm trying to say is you could forget about ever making things change based on getting companies to ban these chemicals. They will always be able to just change one little substituent group on there, and you're still going to have a phenol activating an estrogen receptor. So again, the responsibility is on you as an individual. Learn all these things, and it's pretty easy to learn, and just avoid them. Okay, so BPA is a major estrogen. If you want to read more, it's all here. I won't spend too much time on it, but this is why I put my water in a glass bottle, okay? I only use glass. I don't store my water in plastic bottles. That's the worst thing is if it heats up in a car, then you get more leaching of the estrogen into the water. The other thing is a lot of people will buy oil, for example. Oil, I think you shouldn't be eating at all, but if you have oil and it's in a plastic container, remember, like dissolves like. So it's going to leach way more into that oil. So it's absolutely super estrogenic and a bad idea. Okay. Phthalates are a plastic conditioning agent. We'll talk about those a little more separately. Here's just a quick summary again of what I was telling you about for the liver to excrete estrogen. The liver will take the estrogen, phase 1 detox, it'll hydroxylate it, phase 2, it'll glucuronidate it, which is like a carboxylic acid on a glucose molecule that attaches to the estrogen. The liver then expels the estrogen into the bile. The bile goes into the intestinal tract, and then we defecate it out. That's how our body poops out extra estrogen. That's what it's normally supposed to do. But here's the problem. There's two types of gut flora. There's one from plants, which is the good stuff because of our fiber. It's symbiotic with us. It wants to keep us alive. Our colon is a good apartment for those bacteria. Whereas for the processed food and the meat bacteria, they haven't been in humans that long because all this processed food and ready availability of meat's only been around a short amount of time. So they don't care about us. They don't care if we live or die. They're too stupid to realize the benefit of living there. So they're not symbiotic with us. And they just cleave off this glucuronic acid. And now this estrogen, once it doesn't have the glucuronic preventing it from being reabsorbed, it just gets reabsorbed in their body. So the meat eaters got way higher estrogens because they keep reabsorbing their estrogen. Okay. This is another way that fiber benefits you from plant foods, is it helps you to poop out your estrogen and prevent yourself from getting estrogen overloaded. Okay, we talked about deodorants and how shaving your armpits cause more absorption, not good. I got a lot of papers here. We don't have to go through all of them, but we talked about a lot of metalloestrogens, and these estrogens causing apathy, sometimes depression in persons. Men are a little more vulnerable to this. We talked about the apathy in men. Here it is, estrogen receptor alpha associated with apathy in men. Triclosan was a common cleaning chemical estrogen. Almost all of these cleaning chemicals are going to have estrogens in them because they make a really good detergent. And you could have chloride leaving groups that function like hydroxyl groups. So triclosan, look at the name, trichloro. So there's 3 chlorines, 1, 2, 3, and this functions like a phenol group. So these are estrogenic. So you don't want these in soap. A lot of people are always trying to rub chemicals on themselves. Like, for example, I don't cook with oil. I don't need a dishwasher even, okay? So you avoid dishwasher detergent. I do my laundry with no detergent. I just put it on hot. I have a Korean lady doctor friend. She says, oh yeah, in Korea, we just boil our laundry. I run it hot a little longer, and then in the dryer, maybe I'll run the dryer a little longer, fine. I don't put any laundry detergent on there. I'm fine, okay? I've been doing that decades. I never had a problem. Okay, cleaning chemical estrogens. Now, the big one's nonylphenol. And that name here, let me move this a little bit here. If you look at the nonylphenol, the best one to look at is right here. Nonyl is for 9. That's a prefix for 9. So there's 9 carbons. That's the hydrophobic tail, nonpolar. And then here's the phenol group, the benzene ring with the hydroxyl group. And it's on the 4 carbon, the attachment of the tail. So that's why it's called 4-nonylphenol. This is the typical thing you're going to see. It looks like a sperm. This is the typical thing you're going to see in a detergent. This is a more complex version of nonylphenol. So there's different subtypes depending on the amount of branching of the hydrocarbon chain. But you can all see they're all amphiphilic. And that's what detergent has to be. It has to be partly hydrophilic, getting into the water aqueous solution, and it'll pull the chemical into it, but it needs this hydrophobic tail because that pulls the oily grease into water solution. That's how it does it. Okay, but these things are estrogenic. You can see how that's going to bind the estrogen receptor. It fits right in. That's going to form a hydrogen bond with the estrogen receptor like this, like we talked about. Anything that does that will activate that estrogen receptor to variable degrees. We talked about the capacious outer part of the enzyme pocket, and it can handle anything like that and bigger things. And so there's a whole bunch of these. These are often called alkyl phenols. Nonylphenol is the classic one, though. And so this is another reason why I think you want to avoid some of these soaps and detergents. Okay, parabens are like parabenzoic preservatives, and para is from the nomenclature of a benzene ring. Basically, imagine that you've got a carboxylic acid right here. We'll call it a benzoic acid. If you have the adjacent substituent added group at this location, that's called the ortho position. If you have it right, and I call ortho, I said it looks like an eye, so I draw a little eyeball in there. That's how you can remember ortho for eye. Meta, right? And I used to remember everything in med school like this with word association tricks. Okay, M for meta position. And I say, well, M for meta looks like a mustache. So the M position's right here. So it's 2 carbons away downstream from the carboxylic main substituent. Okay, but then if it's at the bottom, it's like a para. That's the para position. And it protrudes like a beard, if you will. So that's how I remember para position. So this is a typical parabenzoic acid. And then you can put all kinds of different groups added to it. There's a whole bunch of varieties of parabens. So they're a very common preservative. Again, these are great preservatives. They're never going to go away. Great lifetime shelf life because of the aromatic benzene ring, and great antimicrobial ability. The antimicrobial prevents mold from growing in your cosmetics or whatever the product is, your moisturizer, your sunscreen, you name it. So it can sit on the shelf for 4 years if it doesn't sell right away. And these also interfere with thyroid function. Lots of estrogens are goitrogenic. They impair thyroid function. Okay, phthalates are plasticizers, ubiquitous, super common. If you want, you can read more details about it, but just know anything with plastic, but also fragrances have phthalates in them. Phthalates are all over the place. They're in fragrances, air fresheners, paints, enteric coating on some pills, nail polish. Anything that smells bad, it's probably bad for you. I trust my nose. If my nose thinks something smells bad, I don't like it. Okay. So, I like, for example, if I'm in the kitchen, I'm peeling a carrot, and then somebody's doing the dishes, they open the dishwasher, I get that smell of soap from the dishwasher. I'm like, well, why'd you do that? I'm trying to peel a carrot. They go, oh, we'll go in the other part of the room. I go, there's no light over there. They go, oh, you're autistic, you're crazy. I go, no, I'm not. It's because I trust my nose. That smells. That's estrogenic laundry detergent. Okay. So you can see the more you know, it kind of can make you a little awkward around your families, but it's still worth knowing. Okay. All these things, shampoos have it, liquid soaps, hairsprays, packaging, really smelly shower curtains, the vinyl ones like baby's crib mattress, it smells. All these chemicals are bad. If it smells bad, trust your nose. Your nose smells something is bad for a reason. That's to protect you. Okay, here's some paper on vinyl flooring crib mattresses, exuding lots of estrogenic chemicals, these phthalates in particular. Here's the marijuana effects of estrogen. So I just give these papers. If you want to read more about them, you'll find plenty of stuff on these topics. Lavender and tea tree oils, estrogenic. So you want to avoid these things, okay? And that's interesting too. The word for lead is PB for plumum, and they were bathing in estrogenics, okay, and lavender too. So the Romans got exposed to a lot of lead, which was neurotoxic, whereas Americans are being exposed to aluminum in their water, F- and estrogenics, and that can cause cognitive impairment. It can cause estrogenic side effects. You don't even realize it. You got to know these things exist to avoid them. Okay, we talked about the mycoestrogen, zearalenone, and moldy grains. Anything with old mold in it can get that problem with the Zea. We talked about the estrogens and sunscreens. How I personally think sunscreen is kind of a joke. Maybe if you have no choice, you got to go in a tropical place, you can't get away. Like people sometimes ask me, do I want to go to the beach? I'm like, I don't want to sit around at the beach all day. I can just go out in my backyard, put my back to the sun for a little while, and I get plenty of sun. So I know some people like it. All I'm saying is be careful with these sunscreens because a lot of these chemicals are transdermally absorbed. and they stay in your body for days and days and days, and they have estrogenic effects. Okay. All right, benzophenone and oxybenzophenone. These are common sunscreen chemicals. And like I said, they get absorbed into your blood in significant amounts. They even banned some of these things because they were causing all the animals living on the coral reef to become infertile and to die. And so the coral reef was depleted of life because people got so much sunscreen in those areas. Now, I do have some lecture at my YouTube channel on sunscreens, but I don't even use them, so I don't really care about them. But there's certain types that are a little safer. You want to avoid nanoparticles. Nanoparticles, I worry about them potentially crossing the blood-brain barrier. I have a friend who's a nuclear medicine physician, and I said, it concerns me that nanoparticles, maybe they've got access to cross the blood-brain barrier. Do you know anything about that? He goes, well, I haven't heard for sure about that. He says, but I would be concerned about that. So you can potentially see if you can make sure if you buy a sunscreen that it doesn't have nanoparticles in it. That's what I would do. And I think like the more primitive and basic and thick something is, the less likely it's going to traverse the skin and be transdermally absorbed. That's what I would go for. The less estrogenic, the better. Okay, red number 40, these food colorations. You hear red number 40, that sounds like a harmless, cute little thing on a kid's candy. You know what? That's a petroleum-based toxic chemical. These are just euphemisms. Okay, look at the size of this chemical. This activates the estrogen receptor. Not good. A lot of these food dyes can potentially be neurotoxic, and they've got rate limits of mercury and certain other chemicals and lead in some of these food dyes. You'd be surprised. They're more toxic than people think. This is again reason why you just like, how can you win the game? I would say no processed food. If you avoid all processed food, you'll always avoid this red number 40. It can also be in cosmetic products. It could be in lipstick, it could be in a lot of things. Okay, estrogens in drinking water. Municipal water filtration is not going to remove them. That's why I told you. At a minimum, have a carbon water filter for your drinking water. Better yet, whole house carbon filter. That's what I got. I got a whole house carbon filter. I got a kitchen reverse osmosis filter. And I store my water in glass. That's what I do. And I always eat a little first because reverse osmosis water is sort of hypoosmolar. It's sort of over purified, but that's a topic for another day. Kind of interesting. Oh, here's the other thing. Oh, you got to drink 8 cups a day. I think that's nonsense. All right. Let me tell you something. I wrestled in college. We sweat off 5 or 10 pounds in a practice back. This is in the 1980s. We didn't drink any water in practice. The guy who won the marathon, 26 miles back in the 1960s, they didn't drink any water. Everybody, they'll go to the health club. They basically barely do anything and break a sweat. They're always with their bottle of water and plastic. You don't need to do that. I mean, if you want to drink water, fine. But what I'm saying, based on my memory and experience, they didn't start talking about 8 cups of water a day until they started selling Gatorade and they started selling bottled water. And that happened, as far as I can recall, sort of late 80s, early 1990s. And so here's my joke. A lot of this water, it's got high estrogens in it. So you're drinking your 8 cups of estrogen a day. And the way you know that's a joke, think about a 300-pound football player lineman. Does he need 8 cups of water? The same amount as, like, let's say you got a real thin lady weighs 80 pounds, 90 pounds. Do they both need the same amount? Of course not. So anyways, I'm just saying, be careful, because I've seen a lot of fat ladies walking around this big gallon jar of water. I'm drinking my water. I'm healthy. And I'm like, I don't think that's the answer, And by the way, a lot of fish are going extinct, and they think a big part of it's due to these estrogenic chemicals. And if the fish are going extinct and being made infertile, overexposure to estrogenic chemicals to people too, I think is going to dramatically lower fertility rates. Your people are being exposed to way more estrogen than they realize. And what's the good news? You can avoid this stuff. Just being aware of it, you avoid it. Okay, estrogen autoimmune disease. These estrogenics will have effects on the immune system. Excessive exposure to estrogenics is thought to increase the risk of autoimmune disease, including lupus. And it can be paradoxical. It'll increase certain things, decrease other things. Leaky gut's the big thing to know with autoimmune disease. Okay, but all right. Obesogenic compounds. We talked about activation of the PPAR gamma receptor, arcuate nucleus hypothalamus. Here's something a little bit interesting. Atrazine in these frogs. It'll turn the male frogs into female frogs. These are brothers, and they're having sex with each other because this one's been feminized by exposed atrazine. The other one hasn't. Atrazine is a powerful thing that's sprayed on all the corn, the non-organic corn. That's why I don't eat it. And they use that to make high fructose corn syrup, demasculinization. And, the companies are always going to say, the scientists have figured out, this guy, Tyrone Hayes, he got harassed when he published that article. So they'll harass a scientist who tells the truth. And that's why a lot of science, modern science, is really just advertising, because the scientist wants to get grant money to continue their career. And the only way big corporations will give them grant money is if they promote their product. So if a guy tells the truth about a product saying, it had a negative effect, he doesn't get grant money anymore. And they'll sometimes even cause more problems for the poor guy. This guy says they cause more problems for him. So what I'm saying, there's no incentive to tell the truth when you find something negative about a product. There's the old joke, a patient cured is a customer lost. So what I'm saying is, there's a problem with a lot of modern science where when it's being funded by corporations, they're interested in advertising. They don't care about science, real science of figuring out the truth about stuff. Let's see. Chronic exposure to herbicide action also causes mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance. You don't want that. Okay. It's also been associated here with causing decreased immune function and inhibition of complex 3, possibly complex 1 in the electron transport. This is what I meant, that no matter what you do, you're being exposed every day to some mitochondrial toxins, to some estrogenic. So that's why everything that you can control, the wise thing to do is control everything that you can control and make those all optimal. And I think you can go a long way with that. Okay. I can tell you, I talk to a lot of young people and they say things to me like, oh man, your videos are too long. Everybody has attention deficit today. You really should make your videos too long. It's not so long. And I'm like, what do you mean everybody has attention deficit? They go, well, we just do. We're the internet generation. And I said, that's absolute BS. By the way, just, my problem is too much concentration. I'll sit down and start reading something or a project. I can't get up for 3 hours. I go, man, I got to exercise before I get a DVT. But what I'm saying is I'm 59 years old. I don't got any problems. If you eat healthy, you could be really healthy and fit with no medical problems well into your late years. Okay. That's normal for humans. This idea that everybody's supposed to be fat and sick with attention deficit, that's not true. But you don't want to be like the crowd if the crowd is fat, sick with attention deficit. You want to try to improve your function. And I think there's good reason to believe that you can do that. Okay, here's another. These are just typical things that happen. For example, a lot of people will spray their grass with toxic chemicals. It could be atrazine, for example. Then they'll have a little dog, and then they'll like to sleep with the dog in the bed. Well, then the dog's getting all those chemicals into the bed, and they're rubbing on the people, okay? And as a matter of fact, in my old neighborhood, my old house, I was aware of this, and I made a flyer. They put in everybody's mailbox. And then I did my lawn with a push mower, and I didn't want to spray all this crap on there. And guess what happened? Everybody told me I had the worst lawn in the subdivision. They told me I'm lowering the property value of the house. My kids said they were embarrassed to bring their friends over. One of my neighbors insulted me for having such a crappy lawn. I was mocked as being like Sisyphus for trying to pull the dandelions and cut them. So what I'm trying to say is, who gives a rat's tail so much about whether or not you have a dandelion in your grass, okay? You're taking all this good topsoil, you could be growing food, and instead you're trashing all your topsoil with all these toxic chemicals. I personally think it's ignorant, but I'm in such a small minority that I always get overruled. I'm very much used to losing arguments, even when I know I'm right, just because I get overruled. That happens to me, unfortunately, all the time. And these chemicals are so powerful, they would not only lower testosterone, they'd be lowering sperm counts. They're not even sterilization. They're actually like totally dramatically lowering testicular function. It's almost like a chemical castration. These chemicals are more powerful than you think. These are articles about nonylphenols, for example. These are some of these sunscreen chemicals. I'm telling you, these chemicals are powerful and they have a lot of overlap between them, what they do. UV filter just means sunscreen chemical. Okay, so how do I find a pathway? How does one navigate this jungle of chemical estrogenic complexity? Be a minimalist, okay? Don't use stuff you don't need, all right? If you go into my bathroom, you'll see nothing but a bar of transparent soap, the simplest one you could get. Not a single chemical in my bathroom. That's it. I don't even use shampoo. I just rinse my hair with water. I don't need shampoo. Not just because I'm bald. I got some hair on the side, okay? You don't need use shampoo. Then you go in my wife's bathroom. We have separate bathrooms. That's the secret of a successful marriage, apparently, according to Dave Barry. Okay, what we do is she got like 55 chemicals. I said, why you got so many chemicals? You don't even know what's in this chemical. She's like, you don't understand. I go, what do you mean I don't understand? She says, a woman would rub SHIT on her face if she thought it would make her pretty. I go, that's what you're doing. You shouldn't be rubbing all those chemicals on yourself. She goes, you're just jealous because you have wrinkles and I don't. So, fine. You can win an argument that way, but my advice, avoid these things. Just save a lot of money too. Being a minimalist, you save money and you're healthier. I think it's a good way to go. Some people say, well, I'll get a substitute product. Like I'll get a deodorant that's going to have less aluminum or no aluminum. I would watch out for that because usually it's going to still have some estrogenic chemical in it. Here's my bathroom. So my joke is that's not my liquid soap. There's some guys who will lift weights in my basement and they have that there for them. All I have is some little tiny bar. So by the way, this is my bathroom. I call it the magic bathroom. I'll read, books on here and I put pictures of my heroes on the wall and all this stuff. And it gives me a lot of energy. It's a long story. I won't get into it now, but good things have come from the bathroom. It's a secret place. I read at least a book a week in there. All right. Organic farms have just as much yield as conventional farms that spray all these pesticides. So don't let anybody tell you, oh, we have to spray tons and tons of pesticides. We can't grow any food. That's actually not true. That's been studied and shown at Cornell. That's where T. Colin Campbell's from. Okay. All right. Soy has been shown in some contexts to have goitrogenic effects, inhibiting some enzymes in the thyroid. Genistein is the main estrogenic chemical in soy. It's isoflavone is what it's called. That's a subtype compared to lignans, which are much more common in, let's say, flax. So here's just a paper showing goitrogenic. That means hypothyroid effects from soy. Here's another paper of soybean-induced goiter in the female infant. So they stopped the soy that went away. This is my joke again. Why does soy and flax have off-the-chart estrogen chemicals? Okay, they don't have breasts. They don't have a Virginia. What do they need all that estrogen for? And to me, it's obvious, because it's a birth control pill for the animals that eat them. So they want the animal to stop eating them. And they're potentially having a hypothyroid effect too. So that's why I'm not a big fan of that stuff. And again, I came to this stuff just because I want to keep my testosterone high. And then I learned about all the stuff about breast cancer and prostate cancer. So like I said, I think my lecture is going to be complementary to what you learn from other speakers on the subject, because most of them don't go much into this stuff. Okay, what are some of the good things about soy? It is relatively low in methionine, but it's still very high in protein. It's also very high in fat. And there have been some studies showing increased cancer effect, especially in mice. Okay. There's some people who will tell you, some experts who on breast cancer will say, well, it appears to be carcinogenic on mice, but not so much in humans. And I'm not so sure that's true. I know that's what's the word on the street, but I'm not convinced that that's the truth, even though I know that that's been published, and I think there's a reason for that. I'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, the role of insulin-like growth factor. Yes, soy increases insulin-like growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor is associated with increased cancer. So I'm seeing some contradictions here, and I'm going to tell you something. This reminds me of caffeine. You know, everybody says coffee, it's great. You know, coffee's got all these health benefits. And I've sort of seen, as I call it, the miracle of billion-dollar sales. Anytime you've got a food that has millions or billions of dollars in sales, all of a sudden people start saying it's got all these health benefits. Okay. Corporations that are making all that money, they can afford to pay for tons of advertising. They could buy the journal. They could buy the scientist. That scientist will never work again unless he says their product is good. So that's the problem with corporate funded science. Okay. Let's see. Dependent gestator is similar to observed with genistein. Okay, in summary, the glycoside genistein, like genistein, stimulated estrogen-dependent breast cancer cell growth in vivo. Okay, with this was a human breast culture cells. Okay, so that was a human cell. So I want you to know there has been some work in that area. I know there's plenty of studies that said it doesn't have effect, but here's a famous paper. I call this the Mueller paper. And what one can see here, so Mueller, Stefan Mueller is the guy who wrote this paper, 2004. And you're going to hear a lot of people quote this paper. They go, well, it's been shown that the genistein, for example, the soy isoflavone, it primarily affects the good receptor, the estrogen receptor beta. It doesn't affect much the estrogen receptor alpha, the bad one. Okay, well, guess what? Which is primarily the sex characteristics, you know, making the uterus and the breast grow. Guess what? There's not that, when you actually look at the chart, there's not that big of a difference. Okay. Some papers will say, you know, in the ballpark, 4-fold, 7-fold differences. But what I'm trying to say here, there's not that big of a difference. Remember, you can get very high levels of a lot of these different estrogenics. So I wouldn't be so sure you're not going to have an effect on these estrogen receptor alphas. I don't think that's a safe statement. Okay. So I would be aware of that. And look at these, look, you can just look at the chart and match them up here. Let me, so I can match this thing up. Okay, well, I clicked off it, but you'll see the paper yourself. It's available free. And here in the second part of the paper, they did more than one experiment with these estrogen receptors. And in the second part of the paper, the estrogen receptor alpha was activated more than the estrogen receptor beta. Okay, this is ER alpha, estrogen receptor alpha. Here's ER beta. And look, there's more of an effect here on the estrogen receptor alpha than there is on the beta. So I wouldn't be so sure you're not having a significant estrogen receptor alpha, the bad one, versus estrogen receptor beta, the good one. Okay, this is the Mueller paper. Here's the reference. If you want to look it up, go ahead. All right. The role of insulin-like growth factors associated with increased cancer risk. Well, soy increases insulin-like growth factor. Not as much as milk, but it does. So wouldn't that potentially be worrisome? They're mitogenic, causing cell replication. Soy increases insulin-like growth factor. Here's the paper right there if you want to read about it. So also, it lowers sperm counts. You know, per milliliter, the population exposed high isoflavones. And this was done at Massachusetts General, MGH, man's greatest hospital, is what they claim to be at Harvard. Okay, they found that per individual milliliter, 41 million sperm less. Okay, 41. I would prefer to keep that 41 million sperm. Okay, that's going to be associated with increased risk of infertility. Okay, that's a lot of sperm, 41 million per milliliters, you know, cubic centimeter, cc. All right, here's some more stuff about soy causing precocious puberty is thought, you know, based on what was fed to the child. And there's several of these case reports, they stop the soy and the precocious puberty goes away. Premature development of breasts, thyroid. Okay, the main thing I think probably causing a lot of this premature puberty, I'm going to guess a lot of the people are drinking a lot of high-fat milk with tons of estrogen. The cows are pregnant nowadays. They're engineered to make milk while they're pregnant, so their estrogen's real high, and that'll get into the milk. Because I've seen it. I've seen relatives and friends have a daughter in premature puberty with premature thyroid. And so you stop these estrogenic supplies. So this one was with soy. Dagen is the other isoflavone estrogen in soy, but it's relatively small amounts. The vast majority is genistein. So that's a little bit about that. Let's see, more precocious puberty case reports and stuff. Oh, and listen to this. Precocious puberty is so common nowadays that a lot of experts have said, perhaps we should redefine the age of normal puberty. Yeah, right. Why don't you fix the problem? They just want to redefine the age, avoiding the responsibility of figuring out what's going on and trying to help all these poor kids. Okay, premature thyroid, another one related to dietary soy exposure, 7-month-old infant, okay, getting breasts from eating soy formula goes away when she stops. That's an estrogenic effect, okay? That's an important point. That's an estrogenic effect. Okay, dietary genistein, being associated with breast cancer is another paper. This guy I all read, he wrote several papers to that effect. In summary, the glycoside genistein, like a glycone genistein. So that's relevant. This is going to come up again. Okay, now there's some studies that saying the women who had a lot of soy had less breast cancer, okay, and especially in the Asian population. And a lot of them say there was no effect, no significant association between soy consumption and for postmenopausal breast cancer. Other ones say, soy intake in Asians, the amount that's a little bit variable. But the point I want to say is there are some papers that suggested that soy is beneficial for a breast cancer woman. I'm aware there are some papers that say that, but when I looked at those papers closely, to my ability, there seems to be a problem with that. And I'm going to share with you what my impression was. Okay, here's another paper. This one's from 2007, American Cancer Society. There is very little human data on the role of phytoestrogens in preventing breast cancer recurrence. And the few studies that have been done do not support a protective role. Okay, so be aware of that. Okay, I'll outline a little detail. Like I said, flax is the big supports of dietary lignans. That's another type of estrogen, a little bit different than the isoflavones of soy. This is just more of the same type of stuff. You can read it if you want. It's more of the same. But here's what's interesting. You look at soy, look how high these estrogens. First of all, let me give you a baseline. You talk about, cereal, tea, all these other foods, they're going to be miniature amounts, all these like less than 1 numbers. All right. Now you go into soy, you're in the thousands. The total amount of phytoestrogens in one serving of soy was like between 7,400 to 8,600. Okay. That's a ton of estrogenic chemicals, a ton. All right. And then you look at flax. Flax is off the charts. Flax is way, way, way more. If soy is high, flax is like up at the ceiling. It's so high. Tons of estrogen chemicals. I'm a macho man. Okay. I was a college wrestler. I want my testosterone high. I like to be strong. Okay. I'm proud of being masculine. Fine. All right. So what I'm saying is, last thing I want to do is be eating all this estrogen. All right. I have zero interest in that. That's what got me interested in this subject. Okay. So now you take a look at this. Here is flax, off the chart estrogen, just oodles and oodles of estrogen. It's like the most estrogenic plant in the world, practically. I think it is. All right. And then look at soy. Soy is, significantly less than that, but it's still got a ton. It's about 1/4 as much, but it's still tons of estrogen. Then you go to a black bean, 9, and that's a high estrogenic bean. The other beans are way lower, other plant foods lower. So what I'm saying is the estrogen content in flax and soy, it's off the charts. Okay. I want to be high testosterone. I'm going to run in the opposite direction compared to that. Okay. And then this is something about emphasis. Why did I show this? Oh, I talked about the chemistry of fatty acids. All right. Soy protein. And they tell bodybuilders sometimes soy protein might not be as good as whey protein, but it still helps you to grow, build muscle. Okay. Anabolic effect. Okay. And here it is. In this study, the soy protein had a more pronounced effect on insulin-like growth factor than did the milk-based protein. Okay. So it's increasing ILGF. So you see the contradiction here? How could this substance be estrogenic and increasing insulin-like growth factor and be high fat? And you're going to tell me that prevents cancer? I find it hard to believe that. All right. Do phytoestrogens reduce the risk of cancer? Okay, this paper says not enough evidence. So I don't know how anybody could say, oh, there's clear evidence it's beneficial when there's all these papers, some showing it's harmful, other ones showing it's unclear. Okay. And I actually think I maybe figured out the trick. There might be more to it, certainly, but here's another conflicting data. All right. This one is what? Conflicting data. There's a lot of these. It can interfere with tamoxifen. Okay, fine. Because it's maybe activating that alpha receptor. That's why it could interfere. Ultradevelopmental weight gain in pregnant rats. Prebutal onset was advanced. Okay, we're looking for my good paper. By the way, why is there so much soy and why is there so much corn? Because there are alternated products. So typically, and they use them to feed cattle. You grow soy one year, it's a legume, so it puts a lot of nitrogen in the soil. The next year, the same farmer lot of land, they then grow corn and it'll gobble up the nitrogen. Then the next year you alternate, you grow soy. That's why you constantly see all these endless fields growing corn or soy to feed all the cattle and the chickens and all these other animals. They even feed farm fish that stuff nowadays. Because it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, it's over promoted in my opinion. Anything that's a big money maker gets over promoted. And then there's a lot of doctors who are, I think, good doctors and they're promoting soy. And, they're entitled to their opinion, but I'm just giving you my opinion based on reading it. And I think based on my study of it, that none of them are mentioning all these problems. It increases insulin-like growth factor. That increases cancer. It has heme iron, which is unique to a plant. That's associated with increased cancer and oxidative stress. That's never talked about. It's processed typically with hexane. That's a neurotoxic petroleum chemical, a very toxic substance, causes a lot of other potential effects. That's never mentioned. So you're not just eating some soy like some Asian farmer that grew in their backyard. Most people are eating GMO soy processed with hexane, which to me sounds worrisome. Okay, and who knows the effect of GMO? Glyphosate is thought to be estrogenic and have a lot of other potential side effects. There's additives. That's the main ingredient in the Roundup, but you got all these other additives. Who the heck knows what they do? They're synergistically toxic, and they keep on having to spray more and more because the weeds are becoming resistant. So they got to keep periodically increasing the amount sprayed. So that's a lot of herbicide and pesticide spray. And you're eating, these cattle that are eating that stuff too. They're going to be full of it. That's another bad reason for eating meat. Okay. And there is significant binding of the estrogen receptor alpha. Yes, it's not as much as beta, but it's still a significant amount. And you can get very high levels of this stuff. So that's potentially toxic. These are not like your little tiny levels of endogenous normal physiologic estrogen. This is worrisome in my opinion. Okay, Anthony J believes it potentially even affects opioid receptors, which can make a person like it better. But I don't know. I only saw one paper on that. I don't know if that's really relevant or not. Okay, it's high in protein as well, which I don't like. It's high in fat. It's about 37% of calories from fat. I don't like that. And by the way, a lot of those fat are omega-6. You're worried about omega-6 fats. I think soy's in the ballpark of 7-to-1, omega-6 to omega-3. Okay, so what I'm saying is, I heard one, physician say, well, soy is carcinogenic for breast cancer in mice, but it hasn't been shown to be in human. It appears to be beneficial in human. And I'm not so sure that's true, even though I know that's the word on the street and that's what's popular published and that's what people think. I will share with you in a moment what I think it is. And here I think is the big secret. You ready? This is an AO, academic orgasm. You ready? You got a major confounding variable in humans with dairy. Okay. And you also have a major confounding variable with regard to the other plant foods. So what I'm saying is usually when a person starts drinking soy milk, it's because they want to stop drinking dairy and they start moving towards the whole soy milk mentality. It's part of moving towards eating more plant foods. And what I'm saying is I think the plant foods and getting rid of the dairy is the main thing protecting these patients based on my impression of the reading rather than the soy itself. What I'm saying is I think that meat is a major toxin and so are oils. I think soy, in my opinion, is a minor toxin, estrogenic toxin. And then I worry about these baby formulas because the baby gets this genistein and other dagene and these other soy estrogens off the charts they can be really high. And babies have like a mini puberty and it can have an effect on them. I worry what that is. And kids are exposed to tons of other estrogenic chemicals. And I think some of these children that are a little bit confused about their feelings, some of that might be because they're exposed to estrogenic chemicals off the chart. And that might be confusing these children and also making them unhappy and stuff because they don't understand it. Okay. And their parents probably don't understand it either, but it's a good thing to be aware of. So one of the things, if I had a kid who was, unhappy or confused, I would, first of all, I'd reduce all these estrogenic chemicals. I would get rid of all these food dyes, no processed food. Those food dyes can have major effects on children, as well as can potentially some of these other chemicals. Potentially, I'm not going to get into all that stuff now. I could give a whole lecture on toxicology of food additives. That's a different topic. But what I'm saying is, there's a tendency to say, this child's attention deficit, the kid's messed up, he's got brain damage, give him this medication. Why don't you say, what's wrong with the child? Maybe we could find out he's been exposed to some chemical and remove that exposure and the kid will get better. Don't blame the kid. Why don't you blame the kid's environment and figure out how to help the kid? That should be the first thing done, in my opinion, based on my study of the subject. Okay. This is kind of saying the same thing. In an infant exposed to soy formulas, plasma levels of isoflavone can be 13,000 to 22,000 times higher than the normal bodily produced estradiol. And in that context, the chemicals can have activate estrogen receptor response. Yeah, you're overdosing children with these estrogenic chemicals. I don't think that's a wise thing to do. I think that very likely to be unhealthy. And here is something, there's been a study in humans, this guy Adjent, they shown an effect from estrogen, from soy estrogen. I believe I'll let you check the paper because I don't have the paper right in front of me. But what I'm trying to say is it's an estrogenic effect in humans. That's a big deal. Significant estrogenic effect in humans. And here's one thing just showing that the soy formulas were causing increased hypertrophy of the vaginal lining, of the uterine lining. So the soy is the purple, the cow's milk formulas was the red, and the normal breast milk is the least. So these are having an endocrine estrogenic effect. That's an important point. And these are all kinds of estrogenic effects that have been seen. And they're showing abnormalities of the epithelium, abnormality of the gland formation, abnormality of the different types of epithelia located within the fallopian tube and within the uterus. Of course, these things are likely to have a harmful effect on fertility. It's obvious. Okay. All right. So, in fact, these authors believe there should be warnings on anything that contains soy, especially soy formula for a baby. All right. So, the Mueller paper, like I said, it activates both the estrogen receptor alpha and beta. Yes, significantly more beta, but a significant amount ER alpha. And remember, it can be present in very high concentrations. Okay. And a lot of doctors will say, well, you can have some soy, but limit it to less than 5% of calories. That's what Dr. McDougall says, for example. Okay. But there's other people say, oh, eat all the soy. My opinion is I know a lot of people love soy, so you almost feel like, oh, you got to let them have some. But like I said, 20,000 times more estrogen than most other beans. Who needs that? Okay. And flax even more than that. All right. Let's see what else. And like I said, too, you're not just eating this Asian backyard soy. You're eating probably this GMO, herbicide sprayed, hexane processed stuff. The more something's processed, the worse it gets in general. Okay, some of these papers about the estrogenic chemicals. What about the people who had good results? Well, again, they were tend to be eating very little soy and eating a lot of plant foods, lots of rice and other plant foods, very little meat. I'm going to show you a slide that kind of summarizes it all. All right. These are just the things we talked about: raising ILGF, being high fat, being associated with hypothyroidism, goiter, which can cause obesity, infertility. It's also relatively high in choline. I wonder if that's significant. Heme iron, that's associated with negative health effects. Neurotoxic hexane with a bunch of things. Okay. Oh, flax. I'm not going to get into flax, but just be aware that it has a lot of omega-3s. And, Dr. McDougall has expressed a concern from several papers. He's seen that excessive dietary omega-3s potentially can cause some immune suppressive effect that might make cancer worse. That's the controversy on that. There's tons of potential chemicals in baby formula. It's much worse than people think. I won't get into that today. Okay, now here's probably the most famous breast surgeon in the world, and I like her, and I think she's really good. But I just want to show you one thing about a paper because this comes up. This is a paper was published. The author's name is Messina, and they said that isoflavones, which is the main thing in soy, are not endocrine disruptors. No adverse alteration of thyroid function, estrogen, ovulation. And so what I'm trying to say is, how could it not have any problem in those areas? Apparently, this was a review of 417 studies. Okay, so I was curious. I looked up Messina. Who is Messina? Okay, this guy, probably a very bright guy, but take a look at his position. He is the executive director of the Soy Nutrition Institute. Okay, he's also an associate professor at Loma Linda. And guess what? Loma Linda writes a lot of papers, writes papers supporting the benefits of soy. So what I'm saying is they might be excellent scientists and really bright, but I do believe based on that, there is reason to be concerned that they might be biased. Okay, he's this guy's director of the Soy Nutrition Institute. You support a product and that might help your career. You criticize the product, who knows? Okay, nothing good will come for you, but I'm obligated to tell the truth. That's my worldview. Okay, I want to be a great doctor, and if I'm going to be a great doctor, I have to tell people the truth and try to help them. So that's what I'm going to do. No corporation's ever going to sponsor me for anything. Oh crap! I went backwards on my slide. I want to show you one more thing. Laron syndrome is a deficiency of insulin-like growth factor, and they almost never get diabetes or cancer. So do you really want to be eating soy, which raises your ILGF, or high-fat foods, which are going to increase your insulin-like growth factor and insulin? Okay, that's just another reminder of the effect of insulin-like growth factor. If you got this dwarfism syndrome where you have almost no insulin-like growth factor effect, you don't get diabetes or cancer, okay? What else we got here? So here's what I'm saying, that basically, I believe that soy is made to look good because it's a straw man argument. What's really happening is you're getting the dairy out of the diet. This is what I believe, based on my reading of it, is the primary effect. and that is the main thing. Yeah, obviously there could be more to that. I know soy does have some potential beneficial effect. It can decrease the activity of aromatase enzyme, and that can lower endogenous estrogen, and there could be a benefit to that. But my concern is it can still activate the alpha receptors, the estrogen receptor alpha, and I would be concerned about that. So what I'm saying is, from my impression, switching to more of a plant-based diet, getting rid of the dairy, I think is the main benefit that soy is providing. And I think that's also why the populations to which it benefits, tend to be limited populations where you want that effect. Let's see here. I was reading about it. It was only protective in certain populations. Okay, we talked about the processing of it. So here's what I think it comes down to. It kind of comes down to this, that you've got like a seesaw. When you get rid of the meat and dairy, soy ends up looking good, but I think it's mostly looking good because you're adding the plant foods. There's obviously more to it than that. It does have some benefit. It has some non-estrogenic effects that are benefit. That is true, but it's almost should be considered like a pharmaceutical. Plus, did you ever notice you're not allowed to say some plant cures cancer, but you can say soy or coffee decreases it? When something's $1 billion corporate product, you can say anything about it, all right? They get all this publicity, which I'm not so sure they deserve, okay? And I think this is the big key point. This is an AO, an academic orgasm. I read, like tons and tons and tons of papers, book chapters on this subject before I came to this conclusion. And I think that's the money right there, what's going on. There's obviously more to that. So I know some people are going to say, well, what about this effect in decreasing aromatase? What about this other effect? Yeah, you're right. It does have some beneficial effect. It does have some low methionine. That's all good. Okay. But I see this as a big issue. Okay. And then also people say, well, what about the paper? Here's my experience. If a paper is funded by a corporation, it virtually almost always says the thing is good. Aristotle had said many years ago, I'm basically just about done here. Just got like about two or three more slides. Okay. Aristotle had said a thing cannot be one thing and not be that thing. The exception might be quantum mechanics or Schrodinger's cat. Okay. But remember that. How could soy have all these problems, one after another, paper after paper after paper after paper, and these estrogenic effects, and all of a sudden have not a single problem? I find that hard to believe. Okay. And here's a great quote by Ayn Rand. She says, if you think there is a contradiction, recheck your premises. Contradictions do not exist. Whenever you think you are facing a contradiction, check your premises. You will find out that one of them is wrong. Yeah, and I'm going to bet you that's the case. I'm going to bet you there's not as much of a difference between mice as there is in humans once you remove the confounding variable of dairy and plant foods. Now, don't get me wrong. There might be a true confounding variable. I might be wrong. Okay, I'm happy to have somebody prove me wrong, but I'm just telling you that's what my impression showed. Okay, and here's a paper summarizing scientific research. They tried to double up some experiments done by psychology research, and they found 65% of them, they could not replicate the findings, okay? They found that 75% of these pharmaceutical research papers, they could not replicate the findings. So what I'm saying is the majority of stuff produced in the so-called scientific journals is not true. And I believe that's largely because a ton of stuff is funded by corporations or other people trying to show something looks good to promote it, either a product or an idea or whatever it might be. And so that's why you got to read stuff with a grain of salt. That's why you want to understand the concepts. And I go back to earlier papers. What happened in animals? What are the basic chemical properties of a substance? What is reasonable to expect? And once you start looking at that, you see, well, gee, there really is a lot of problems with caffeine. It mimics the stress response. Gee, there really is a lot of problem with alcohol, etc. Okay. And just to give you a little example, aspartame is a sweetener. When they were trying to get that thing approved, man, they would submit over 100 studies. So a rich company can very quickly produce 100 studies showing their product is beneficial. But, and you get some independent scientists on their own collecting side effects and problems. This guy just published a book of 1,038 pages of complications from aspartame. This guy, only pioneer of understanding cytotoxicity, the key thing for understanding for that and Delatorre's mouse theory is the key thing for understanding dementia. And, my theory contributes to that too. But what I'm saying is this guy knew about excitotoxic problems with aspartame way back in 1970. So the point is that a $1 billion company can pretty much publish whatever it wants, buy the journal, buy the scientist, publish whatever it wants. So you have to be a little careful about taking that with a grain of salt. Okay. So now here's my last slide. And basically, like we're saying, you can have a substance that has some beneficial and some harmful effects. And for example, in this study, it said that soy had lower mortality, was associated with a higher intake of soy, was limited to the women who had tumors that were negative for the hormone receptors. So that implies that when they did have hormone receptor breast cancer, which is 80% of cancers, the soy was not beneficial. Okay. So it had non-estrogenic effects that were beneficial, but that's a limited sample set of breast cancer patients. All right. So I don't think you're going to that easily escape the soy versus dairy versus plants versus meat seesaw. And what I'm saying is dairy is a major poison. You get rid of that, you're a lot better off. Soy is a minor poison. And my prediction is you get rid of that, you'll be better off. But of course, if somebody wants to refute me, go ahead, read all the papers, tell me different, I'll see what you have to say. All right. Now here are some conclusions. Dairy major, soy minor poison. We talked about soy is high in fat, which is high in omega-6. I read one thing, 7-to-1. I'm not sure if that's all in all the papers, but that's what I read in one paper. Soy is a high protein food. It does have some effect to increase insulin-like growth factor, which is known in other contexts to be increasing the risk of cancer. I would worry about that. Omega-6 is associated with inflammation, excessive inflammation associated with increased cancer risk. I would be worried about that, associated with lipid peroxidation, with obesity, et cetera, rancidity, with hydroxynonenal, which is, neurotoxic, pancreas toxic, increasing, risk of diabetes, thought by Yamashina in the Asian populations, especially who eat a lot of fried food. Soy contains heme iron. Well, iron, we tend to be iron overloaded. That's thought to increase the risk of cancer. It does activate both receptors, both estrogen receptor alpha and beta, even though more beta, the good one. The biologic purpose of it is to, I believe, protect soy and function like a pesticide, make them infertile. That's my best guess. So its mechanism and the reason for its existence in the plant soy. Okay. America has rising infertility, which might be related to the increased soy intake. I don't know for sure if that's the only reason. There's probably multiple reasons, all these other estrogenic chemicals. Soy decreases male sperm production. That's very worrisome. That's certainly an endocrine effect. So I don't think you could call that a non-endocrine disrupting chemical when it's been shown to do that. For pregnant women, it does appear to cause problems in the baby, which might be transmitted to the future. The baby might have increased risk of being infertile. It's usually GMO, unknown significance, but probably bad. It's usually sprayed with glyphosate and GP additives, which can be quite toxic. I actually am looking at these slides on a computer that's not my regular computer, but I'll just let you know, I wrote my own final conclusion below this, which isn't able to show up on this slide. And I recall my conclusion. I basically said this: soy is the bad bean. It is uniquely highly estrogenic compared to the other legumes, the other beans. And I would say anything that estrogenic, for me to want it, it would have to do my laundry, cook for me, and please me in bed. Otherwise, I don't want it. I would avoid it. I don't want soy. So that's my conclusion. And that's basically it. I hope that was helpful to you.
Well, you sure stirred up. You opened up, what's that saying? A can of worms, huh?
I just tell the truth. If somebody can refute me, go ahead.
So here's the thing. I take no sides because I like to look at both sides, which is why I never get selected for jury duty. Can you send me at some point links to the articles you reviewed? Because what people are upset about is that Dr. Christy Funk, who's been on this show several times, who's a breast surgeon, Dr. Neil Barnard, Dr. Greger, they're all big fans of soy and flax.
I hear all that. And, all of them are very bright, excellent doctors. All I can tell you is when I look at it, this was my impression. Okay. And I mentioned to you too, there's a lot of these old case reports. There's reason to be concerned about it. That guy Adjent saw effects in humans. Most of the research has been done on animals, but there's a lot of case reports as well. There's reasons to be concerned about it. It's not entirely in animals. There have been some findings in humans. I would be concerned about that. Now, look, I could care less about soy. It's just something I avoid. And I'm not involved in the business of treating breast cancer patients, but I can read scientific articles and I can tell you, and I'm not the only one that thinks this. There's other people who think this. This guy, Dr. Anthony J, is a PhD in biochemistry, specializing in lipids, and he thinks that soy is a major estrogenic toxin to humans, and he would strongly recommend you avoid it. So I don't see, and I'm kind of joking, of course, in my conclusion, but I don't see a benefit to it. So why would I want to get involved with something that I have good reason to believe might have negative effects?
And when you say soy, are you referring to every form, even the whole bean, the edamame?
Now, I would expect that the whole bean would be a much better food. The more you process it, the worse it's going to get, because first of all, I have no idea the significance of the GMO. And then when you have the GMO soy, it's going to be sprayed typically with that Roundup. The main active ingredient is the glyphosate, which has been said to be estrogenic in several papers, and is also, according to this lady, Stephanie Seneff, PhD, who's researched it extensively, she believes it has tons of other negative side effects. Soy is routinely processed with hexane. So it's probably a lot better, sort of just the bean, which might be relatively unprocessed, the edamame, if you will. Okay, and I'm not an expert on soy processing, but the less processed it is, the better.
Great. Jane wants to know if the information that you presented also applies to women with endometrial or ovarian cancers as it does to breast and prostate cancer. Is the same in estrogen?
Well, my feeling is it probably does, because the prostate's sort of the male equivalent of a uterus. So that's one of the other reasons why I wanted to lower all my estrogen exposures, was to help reduce my risk of prostate cancer. So those would go together. The ovary is kind of unique. The big thing that increases the risk of ovarian cancer is dairy. And the way you can remember what does dairy do is dairy tends to damage anything that's sort of small and round. Dairy increases your risk of cataracts. Dairy can have significant negative effects on the male testicles, and it also can have negative effects on the female ovary. And it is thought that just because a person might have enough lactase to digest the milk sugar, that doesn't mean they can metabolize effectively the byproduct, which is galactose. The lactose gets split into galactose and glucose, and they may not have, it is thought, the enzymes to metabolize galactose, and that is thought associated with cataracts and increased risk of ovarian cancer.
That's interesting that you mentioned dairy, because Michelle, who sent in the questions in advance, which guys, you've got to do when it's medical doctors for sure. She says, does Dr. Rogers have any slideshow presentations or information regarding dairy and lactose when it's in prescriptions and a potential increase in cancer or cancer recurrence? I ask because I have a history of triple positive breast cancer, which loves estrogen. I recently found out that my letrozole, an aromatase inhibitor, has lactose in all the tablet options from all the different pharmaceutical manufacturers.
Okay, and she's getting that again. Excuse me, was that for breast cancer?
Triple positive breast cancer.
Triple positive breast cancer. So she's got the lactose. I'm not aware of that being a problem for breast cancer. I mentioned it in the context of potentially a problem for the ovaries, for the testicles, for the eyes, for cataracts, but and it's probably a real minimal amount.
Right. And why do they put that in the medication, lactose?
I don't know.
Interesting. And so as equally as upset as people are on soy, they're upset that you're telling them that flax is bad, because Dr. Esselstyn even recommends flax seeds.
Well, what I would say is, if they can show, good research and papers to showing the benefit, I would be happy to hear it, but I just doubt it. Because one of the reasons you often hear about, you need all these omega-3s is for brain development, because it fluidizes plasma cell membranes in the neurons and you get more rapid neuronal conduction. But you know what I would say? I'd say, hold on a sec. Okay. Can you remember anything that happened in your childhood? Yeah, you probably can. And why? Because a lot of those neurons, they don't really turn over. That's why you can remember your childhood. Unlike a lot of other cells in the body, which are constantly turning over, your neurons are relatively fixed. You don't need that much omega-3. And Dr. McDougall said the same thing. This is based on my reading the paper. You don't need to be taking all this omega-3. You get enough just from eating a regular plant-based diet. So I don't think you need it. Now, maybe there's some other benefit to flax that I'm not aware of. But Dr. McDougall has brought up the point. Now, I'd be concerned about it too. Are you potentially causing some mild immunosuppressive effect? Now, people used to say, omega-3s, they thin the blood and they decrease blood clotting. And I know that's in the papers, and there's probably a little bit of truth to it, but I was an imaging guided surgeon before I became a neuroradiologist. And I can tell you, I did tons and tons of procedures. We never even paid any attention to whether or not they were taking omega-3 supplements. It had zero effect on bleeding. Whereas if somebody's on Plavix, that's a big deal. I'll do a procedure with a patient on aspirin and I might get a touch bleeding, but not too much of a problem. But Plavix, big deal. Omega-3s, no big deal, irrelevant.
Yeah. It's interesting is people send in their questions in advance when they're on my mailing list, because we mentioned that you were going to be on. And it's funny because Linda's question was for Dr. Peter Rogers. We keep hearing very different things when it comes to soy and female breast cancer. Can you set the record straight? If soy is recommended, what can you do if you have a soy allergy?
Well, I just gave you my thought that I kind of doubt the benefits, that I believe that it looks good because it's a straw man argument. Okay. Like, there was Rodney Dangerfield's a great comedian. He said the fastest way to look skinny is to hang around with fat people. And basically, once you remove the dairy from the diet, you are typically also switching to soy. You're also eating more plant foods. And I think that's going to have a protective effect. And just that switch from dairy to soy is going to have a protective effect. There are some other beneficial things that soy did. Like I said, it has some non-estrogenic effects that were beneficial. But I also mentioned that cancer study whereby it was only helpful in the patients that, were estrogen receptor negative, if you will, and thinking that it's more helpful when it can't have an estrogenic effect, if you will. Because it does have some other positive effects, but there's some counterbalance there. So what I'm basically saying is I doubt there's much benefit from it.
Yeah, great. Well, this is amazing. That I could talk to you forever, except my bladder can't stay on much longer. So you'll be coming back next month. Do you have any idea what you'd like to talk about?
Gosh, I got a lot of different things I could talk about. I could talk about food additives. I could talk about, is organic worth it? A lot of people ask me, is organic worth it? Yes or no? I could talk about water filtration. A lot of people are curious, what are the pros and cons of drinking distilled water versus reverse osmosis filter water versus carbon filter water, all those little tricks. I think I did some experiment with something I call the water paradox. The more you filter water, the more you run into problems. If you take all the bad stuff out, you also make it hypoosmolar, then you run the risk of water intoxication syndrome. So what do you do? And I go through all the plastics. So that could be a fun topic. What else could I talk about? I could talk about the biochemistry of carbohydrates, of proteins. We've kind of exhausted subject. I could talk about proteins or lipids.
Well, next month is actually the month that we do the summit behind me, the truth about weight loss. And I know that's always a popular topic because people still think that carbs make you fat.
If you want, I could talk about weight loss. I could talk about Yamashima. I'd have to review his papers again. Yamashima is a Japanese neuroscientist who believed that the increasing rates of dementia in Japanese was because they're eating more and more oils with the omega-6 fats causing lipid peroxidation that was toxic to their brains. But then he came up with an interesting theory. He also claims that the omega-6 related lipid peroxidation, more common in the ones that couldn't tolerate alcohol because they were aldehyde deficient with the enzymes. They also, he said, even if they weren't deficient in that enzyme, they had more diabetes, which he believed was causing lipid peroxidation of the pancreatic beta cells, the ones that make insulin. And he has pictures of that in his articles. And the reason I found that relevant was, you talk about people from India. A lot of people from India have diabetes. And I was really surprised by that when I first heard that, because most of the Indians I know, they're male doctor friends of mine that are vegetarians and they're all skinny and healthy looking. But it turns out, I think I figured out why. Because they eat too much fried food. A lot of persons of Indian descent in their diet. And Yamashima might be right. That might be causing, that was the only thing I could find from my study of the subject. That might be contributing to increased lipid peroxidation of their pancreas beta cells. Yamashima wrote a paper to that effect. And based on my conversations, because then I talked to a bunch of my Indian friends, do you think this is it? Do you think this is it? They go, well, that might be it.
Wow. Do you think you could possibly get me some of the papers that you were reviewing so we can link to it below?
Oh, you mean about these soy papers?
Yes, the ones that had the negative effects so that we can share them.
Yeah, I could send, I got them all in this talk, but I could maybe like send you the specific titles. So you got them in concise form all together.
Right. Because I'd like to create what's called clickable links so that people can see that you really.
Oh, I get it. Yeah, I could send you that. Sure.
That would be wonderful. Well, I find you very fascinating. Have you ever been able to influence any of your hospital colleagues to eat a more healthful diet?
Yeah, I help a lot of people. They come to me, they want to learn. I like it when I've got the experience that if a person comes to you and they want to learn, you got a decent chance to help them because they're seeking advice, they're seeking learning, they're ready to change. But the vast majority of people, like I run into a lot of people and just have conversations, they almost never change. But I got a lot of doctors and other friends and colleagues and coworkers and relatives. And that's pretty much the deciding factor. If they want to learn and change, they got a good chance to improve and get better and improve. But all these other fat people I talk to, they're nice. All these people fat and sick, they often don't do so well. And I got friends, like a doctor friend, I coached him and he lost like 50 pounds. He was doing great. Then he started back to eating all the junk food and he has a stroke. And that's the thing that people don't realize. They sort of say to themselves, well, if I get fat again, I'll just change when I get fat again. But they don't realize you might have a heart attack or a stroke and then you're screwed. That's irreversible and it's too late. So the wise move is prevent it. A lot of myocardial infarctions present with sudden death. Okay. Just prevent it. Okay. And basically, the artery to the brain, the carotid artery is about 6 millimeters in diameter. The coronary is about 3 millimeters. The Johnson, the pudendals, is about 1.5 millimeters. So a lot of times the Johnson's the first thing to fail on you. That's a good warning sign. And basically the wise move is just minimize atherosclerosis. And then you basically improve blood flow everywhere in your body and everything feels better and works better. It's a win-win all around. And I showed that idea of the 6 blind men and the elephant at the beginning to show that everything is consistent. That's one of the reasons why I'm so confident about this diet is it all works. The epidemiology, the biochemistry, the research study in animals and humans. So.
Yeah. Does your family eat like you?
Some of them do, but I have problems with my family members. For example, my son, is a weightlifter, macho man. They all get tricked because there'll be some bodybuilder guy on the internet who's taking anabolic steroids and he's jacked with these big muscles. And then he tells all these young kids, if you buy my protein supplement, you could be big and strong like me. And the kids are chumps. They don't know any better. They go for it. So they're like, well, gee, Dad, you're kind of a skinny old man. Why would I want to be like you? I could be like this bodybuilder on the internet. I'm like, you don't understand. This guy's taking anabolic steroids. Okay. So I sometimes have some difficulty convincing them, but they move in that direction. Well, my experience with people I've known a long time is they all say, well, I think you're probably right, but I'm not ready yet. I think you're probably right, but I'm not ready yet. And they gradually drift in that direction. The people who make the fastest product are people who want to learn. They come up and talk to me. Hey, I read this article. What's this? What do you think of this? And so, I would love to do more of this nutritional health stuff. I used to do it as a part-time hobby because it's fascinating. It's the most powerful thing in all of medicine and health. And everybody needs it for themselves. Why wouldn't they be fascinated and concerned about it? It's great stuff.
Yeah. Well, Karen says she'd love for you to talk about oils causing dementia because so many of doctors, including plant-based doctors, say it's good. Well, you are very, very entertaining, Dr. Rogers, I got to say.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see you next month. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow when we are going to introduce a new show called Plant-Based Classics with Lauren Bernick. She'll be making a beefless stew with mashed potatoes. Have a great